Christians versus Pharisees, choosing sides and how to fight for them in the Mormon Civil War. Episode 11b. Take back control. Democracy is the way. Not Tim Ballard, end-time preppers, murderous mummy bloggers, or the apostles who made them all inevitable. Greetings, intrepid listeners. This episode 11 series is about bringing together the most convincing and unavoidable reasons for insisting on radical regime change in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the pathway for actually making it happen that has always been there within the scriptures and written constitution of the Restoration. This episode 11b was going to focus on exactly how the government of the USA has started to properly investigate and punish the leaders of the church for some of their many financial crimes, and the legal basis in the Constitution and disciplinary procedures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for disciplining and removing from power the corrupt apostles who have accelerated the self-destruction of the church and the exodus of most of its membership. But the details of that will now have to wait because of, as once Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Harold Macmillan would put it, events, dear boy, events. Rather a lot of the members of the church in the USA have decided this year that they really loved the Netflix true crime documentaries and dramas about sexual predator and murdering Mormons of yesteryear. So they have diligently gone the extra mile to provide them with enough material to keep their film studios busy for a decade all at once. Following developments in Mormonland has been catapulted from dusty disputes about arcane details of 19th century meeting minutes and some inflammatory comments in a general conference talk to a garish tabloid newspaper headline-grabbing spectacle of kidnapping, torture, sexual assault, financial scams, and murder that would be completely unbelievable if it wasn't all so gobsmackingly true. Truth really is stranger than fiction. If you thought the hair-raising craziness of the Wild West adventures of the Mormon pioneers were over, think again. It's all coming back, baby. One of the advantages of being a part-time podcaster taking months to write, record, and edit the Mormon Civil War podcasts is that when I tackle current events, enough time has passed to fill you in on all the juicy details of what happened next. I can also take a larger view of the context and interconnections of seemingly unconnected dramas, and what they all mean for the immediate future of the LDS Church. So come with me on a wild ride. So much has gone on that needs some sense making of it that I will release in rapid succession some additional episodes of the Take Back Control mini-series, corralled as much as I can wrestle it all into a coherent sequence. This episode will make the case for the only strategy that can work for the church to reform itself and save itself from its current tipping point into destruction, with the hopeful message that it is worth a try, and that radical reforms can be made well within the boundaries of its own scriptures and foundational principles, with no need to introduce external or additional belief systems and ideologies. It will also introduce you to the first of several major characters hiding in plain sight in the faithful LDS community, who have secretly been sowing the seeds of murderous mayhem that have suddenly sprouted monsters all over the landscape of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. September 6er and BYU professor Avraham Gileadi. In the next episode, 11c, the shared eternal core of the general authorities and the pseudo-scientific loon bats, we will dive into the 2019 Eternal Core Conference that Tom Harrison organized, to which he invited all his mentees and people representing the different aspects of his worldview, and gave them all the opportunity to speak. You couldn't make it up. They were all there. Jody Hildebrand, Tim Ballard, a scientist telling them to distrust science, the founder of the porn paranoid fight the new drug movement, an energy healer, and a high profile emeritus general authority. Their presentations have just been deleted from YouTube, as Tom Harrison seems to have realised rather too late that he is in deep doo-doo for the murdering monsters he has been mentoring and inspiring in the heart of the LDS Church's religious and political kingdom in the Rocky Mountains. But I got in there first and downloaded them for posterity before the purge. In episode 11D, even the shock jock apologists know all is not well in Zion. We will find out that the most aggressive podcasting apologists, who regularly attack and slander the critics of the church as part of a satanic, atheist, socialist conspiracy, are actually starting to agree with us about what the root causes of the church's problems are. That the church is lying to everyone and failing horribly and avoidably to hold on to its young people. Truth is finally dawning on the Midnight Mormons of Ward Radio, Greg Matson of Quick Media, and even super arrogant Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith. Painfully slowly, but even they can see that the church is falling apart now and that it is the leader's fault. They are becoming much easier to listen to for more than 5 minutes at a time before you want to smash up your phone and kick the dog. They are so massively annoying. The times are a-changing. I prophesy that in the next 5 years, they are eventually going to snap and start voting opposed to the gerontocracy they are now openly identifying as the problem. As many of us in the nuanced and post-Mormon communities have experienced in our own journeys, the more you think and talk through the challenges facing the church, which they do, even from an intensely apologist and fundamentalist starting point, you eventually start arriving at the difficult and unexpected truths about what is really going on. If even they are beginning to experience these reality checks, then anyone can. And in episode 11E, taking it to the top, Church and State Discipline for Apostles Who Steal and Lie, we will take a thrilling deep dive into how the government of the USA has started to properly investigate and reveal the illegal enterprises of the First Presidency and presiding bishopric to hoard vast amounts of tithing wealth and hide it from the government, from the tax authorities, from the financial regulators tasked with keeping the stock market transparent and stable to prevent another Wall Street crash, and from the members of the church. And how, on the basis of that alone, never mind their many lies about many other things, they meet a long list of the criteria in the church's own handbook for immediate church discipline, release from their callings, and even excommunication. And then, in the concluding episodes of this mini-series, we will return to what the general authorities are doing and saying to try and keep the faithful all in and mentally gymnasticating as they run panicked and screaming in the opposite direction of the reforms that could save their religion. At the end of that rodeo ride, I expect nothing less than the mass uprising of ward and stake leaders voting opposed to the gerontocracy, who are driving their children and grandchildren out of their congregations, and the dawn of a glorious era of reforms and healing for our community that has been ravaged by the Mormon Civil War. Huzzah! Remember, you can watch this on YouTube with a feast of visual fun and evidence, or listen on podcast streaming services while you build a boat or do the ironing for 100 people. You can always speed up the playback time. I do. I just can't talk that fast. I'm still following the word of wisdom, so caffeinated Peter isn't a thing. Or rather, following it like modern Latter-day Saints do, which means following half of it. I don't have tobacco, alcohol, or tea and coffee, the devil's urine, with my delicious carnivorous meals of everything else the word of wisdom forbids, like meat and fruit and veg out of season. My man boobs are flourishing, but I can at least still breathe and think, which is nice. I am making much more of an effort in amongst all the long form to also present the key points I'm making as snappy bullet points as we go. My respect for the Book of Mormon improved significantly when I wrote my own summary version of it, and for the first time saw all the story arcs in the long sermons and adventures of the protagonists that you miss when you're reading a few verses in isolation as a chore. So, to prove there is a method in my rambling madness, here's a recap of the things I covered in episode 11a. Early and recent general authorities like Uchtdorf taught truth and transparency, and proactively seeking truth from any and every source. 2 Nephi 29 says that God has spoken to all nations and cultures, so we have permission to go and gather all of that wisdom and truth. My mum's struggles typified the experience of women as mothers and leaders in a church with a deep history of sexism and polygamy and ongoing harm and neglect, while their husbands and leaders are cogs in a machine of untrained, overworked, amateur, and too often harmfully incompetent patriarchy. Doctrine and Covenants 123 tells us to shine a light on all secrets hidden in darkness, and that this is essential for the long-term direction and well-being of the church. This is the opposite message to ignoring things the church is hiding in darkness from us because they are not essential to our salvation. It turns out they really are. Progress requires conflict in Hugh B. Brown's marketplace of thought, where only truth prevails. This religion is meant to be all about lifelong learning to discover all truth and then expecting integrity to that truth personally and from the church. But if you really do live by those principles, the church that taught them to you will punish you and excommunicate you. There is, however, hope for change. Even the most hostile, ordained, and self appointed guardians of authoritarian control can be persuaded to change by their lived experiences and your words to open their minds and be realistic about the challenges we face and the changes required to survive them. The LDS Church is now doing and prioritizing as religious virtues every single one of the 17 things Jesus specifically condemned the Pharisees and Sadducees for doing. As George Orwell's Animal Farm teaches, when your leaders start doing everything they once led a revolution against, it's time for another revolution. Mormonism as a religion is worth fighting for because it sorts out a lot of the gaping holes in the theology of other religions and other Christian denominations. It has a solution in its own scriptures for all the problems we face, specifically that accountability and common consent democracy should be central to all decision making. This would address and solve the vast majority of dysfunctions in the church by giving power and voice back to the collective wisdom and revelation of the whole church membership. The current leadership have forfeited their right to moral, priesthood, and institutional authority by things like throwing recent prophets and the faithful under the bus as giving a victory to Satan, while expecting us to give the same obedience, trust, and loyalty to them as we gave to the people they now tell us were satanic. This is irrational and unfair. They never had priesthood authority in the first place because they ignored the most basic ideas about the transfer of priesthood keys by ordaining themselves without a vote of the people first when Doctrine and Covenants 2065 forbids this. Doing everything Jesus forbade in the New Testament as well is also a red light warning that these are not the prophets and apostles we are looking for. The internet connected information age is ruthless to lies and weakness and complacency. There is an extremely short time limit that is the overriding consideration in considering the future and survival of the church. Therefore, interventions and changes to save it have to be radical and swift and prioritize the feedback from the people driven away, not the ignorant and ineffective opinions of the people who failed to keep them. Prioritize the needs of the last few young people over the dying elderly. Become a true free agent, working out for yourself how to govern yourself based on correct principles with integrity. The dominant answer to faith and trust crisis being offered by general authorities across the correlated teaching curriculum and their public talks, and by their independent apologists like Bruce and Marie Hafen in their Faith is Not Blind project, is blind faith. The Hafens called it non-contingent trust. To trust and obey them unconditionally, even when they are wrong, because only God can hold the prophets and apostles accountable or release and replace them. It is enough to sometimes acknowledge that they have human fallibility as a vague concept, but it is a sin to take any personal, mental, or institutional precautions to address and correct their errors, or to say out loud what their errors have actually been. The mental gymnastics they are expecting church members to apply is extreme. For example, Dallin Oakes has admitted several times that the prophets were, quote, spectacularly wrong, close quote, regarding the reasons for a century and a half of racist segregation. And he still doesn't have a single doctrinal explanation for it to give us. But he insists that it must still have been a true commandment from God, disconnecting the edicts of prophets from the reasons or doctrinal framework that they teach for them at the same time as giving those commandments. Is this really how God or prophets receiving real revelations function? We have the right to expect a rational faith that makes sense on the most basic level. Inept apologists and TBMs keep giving the proof of the dysfunctions, irrational mental gymnastics, and leader worship to their disillusioned loved ones as the solution for that disillusion. Offering the cause of the problem as the solution to the problem shows that they have no understanding of what the problem really is. Another of their tactics, trusting the spirit of the army of the people who stay faithful and loyal to the leaders, backfires because the biggest army in Mormonism is the vast majority of members who have already left it and are still leaving. True faith journeys involve learning to understand, live with, and master the complexity of real life and the subtle and sophisticated thought processes and lifestyle required to thrive, and increasing your empathy and understanding for the people who are broken by life's complexities, especially if the painful difficulties are coming from the faith community itself, not the secular world outside it. Whew! And that was the summary. We get through a lot of stuff. There's a lot to deal with, but there are simple points here. As always, I'm trying to balance ruthless critical analysis with clear proposals for what the better way to go would be, rooted in the foundational principles of Mormonism itself, not external ideologies. Although Mormonism and the Book of Mormon give us permission to enthusiastically welcome all the truths from any source outside the religion that are helpful too. But the good news, to keep it simple and not scare the faithful inside the Mormon bubble, is that we don't even need to add anything external or convert them to other social, political, or religious philosophies. Okay, are you ready for more? Let's go. After an intense 5-year journey as a public activist and advocate for significant reforms in the church I grew up in and love, and still attend despite being excommunicated for speaking up, I think I've arrived at an understanding of the only possible way forward for the church members to save it. Don't panic. This isn't my self-proclamation as a new prophet or the beginning of yet another Mormon splinter group denomination. I am not claiming unique knowledge or revelation about this. As I've said before, I got lucky with a genuinely poetic, inspiring, and so far totally accurate patriarchal blessing, and it says one of my gifts is to be teachable, to recognize good sources of information and learn from them. Everything I talk about in this podcast is trying to join up and make sense of the collective research and wisdom of the hive mind of the wonderful, nuanced, and post Mormon communities that are a massive brains trust and resource of information and life experiences to learn from, and see the big picture and how the LDS Church can be radically but realistically changed for the better. The unique selling point I offer, if there is one, is that I am the only or one of the very few podcasters who is genuinely focused on having the church reform and survive and hopefully deserve to still become a major global religion. The great vision my generation was taught since childhood, while at the same time doing my best to be totally informed and totally honest about what an utter mess the church, its leadership, and its dominant ideology is in. The information I share is already out there, and I quote LDS scriptures more than any other dissident podcaster I know, so I'm not claiming to be the source of this knowledge and the solutions I'm suggesting. What is unusual about this podcast, perhaps, is that I genuinely believe it could be done, and we don't need to start a new church or leave this one to do it. I know from the feedback I get from the podcast that there are a lot of very frustrated Latter-day Saints navigating the same space who are also keen for the church to do much better, while exasperated by its escalating failures. But they are mostly keeping their heads down and raging in quiet desperation. They can see what the problems are. They love that I make sense of the many random things going wrong and have presented and described how they all fit together and why. But they are, for various reasons, stuck, trapped, feeling unable to speak or act publicly about it, and not sure what that would even achieve, since the institution of the church just spits out any troublemakers and seems to mostly carry on regardless. My conclusion is that it will take much more dramatic and urgent and decisive action than most people in my position even imagine is necessary or possible, but that it is possible. This game plan for revolution and reformation, both very loaded and somewhat intimidating terms, but bear with me, is based on a simple, rational calculation, a reality check, that frustratingly seems not to have occurred to most, if not all, of the other people out there hoping and advocating for modernizing reforms in the church so it can survive in the real world. My rational calculation equation has 5 data points. Data point 1. Usually, the answers being proposed by a parade of critics of the church and apologists defending it depend upon gradual, incremental changes over a long period of time, generations even, according to Patrick Mason's 2020 book, Restoration: God's Call to the 21st Century World. This is not the solution. The tiny, incremental baby steps of progress that happened over the last century to eventually end racist segregation, tone down some of the patriarchal sexist rhetoric and such like, didn't happen because a bunch of earnest academics and columnists gently made a case for reframing our doctrines. Wider society had to make radical changes in these matters, and then a persistent movement of outspoken campaigning activists and journalists who regularly got excommunicated for it and had to fight hard eventually forced the leadership to change by keeping up the pressure, publicly exposing their unethical and inconsistent behavior and teachings with truth and reason. So, my conclusion is that since the assertive activists committed to the whole truth, rather than censored propaganda, are the most crucial and effective agents of change in the church, I will choose to be an assertive activist for change, talking about as much of the whole truth as I can muster. The gentle diplomats have a role to play, but the leadership only listens to them after a lot of hard work by the shouting, undiplomatic activists that scares them into realizing they have to change. This sounds like the calculation of the movements with an armed terrorist wing. For the first half of my life, a clear and present danger was posed to my peace and safety by Irish terrorists, particularly the nominally Catholic Irish Republican Army, the IRA. At any moment, they could decide to blow up a car, or a building, or assassinate a government official, or the whole government, like they tried to when they blew up the hotel in Brighton where the Conservatives were having their political party conference. And the risk level was significantly higher when we holidayed in Northern Ireland with our family members there. It was completely normal to be shopping in any Ulster town and know that you were not allowed to park your car and leave it unattended on the high street without a person in because it would be seen as a potential car bomb. It was completely normal to have our bags searched by security officers before we went into shopping centres for weapons or bombs. It was completely normal to drive around Belfast and see yet another building reduced to rubble by the terrorists. To see a teenage army sniper vigilantly looking down the sights of a loaded gun in someone's front garden while people carried on their daily lives. The constant fear, the constant terror. The IRA organized a political wing called Sinn Féin, led by current and ex-terrorists, to stand in democratic elections, to play both games at once. Their calculation was that eventually the British government would get fed up with the terror and negotiate concessions and changes to the way Ulster was governed and policed, and release all the terrorist prisoners, which eventually happened. Hamas have just set the Middle East on fire with the same terrorist calculation. By killing and kidnapping a load of men, women, and children in the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and being willing to sacrifice far more of their own men, women, and children's lives in the inevitable retaliation by Israel's armed forces, they hope to galvanize a regional war that will destroy Israel, slaughter all the Jews, and claim all of Palestine for their people, and eventually have a peaceful homeland that very unlikely and unrealistic way. While other, only slightly less nihilistic terrorists have hoped for their terrorism to at least secure a Palestinian state alongside Israel by threatening everyone to the negotiating table. It is the bully approach to negotiation and reforms, and Israel has for far too long protected and enabled murderous Jewish extremists illegally stealing and settling on Palestinian land and homes as they try to engineer a genocide of the Palestinians. I really don't recommend it. When terrorists are involved, the conflicts drag on for ages and take far too long to resolve and leave far too many open wounds for a truly lasting and peaceful peace. Northern Ireland still has remnant terrorists doing horrendous things and trying to kick off armed conflict again because that was normalized for them in the past, even though the peace process has transformed the country for the better to compared to how it was. The lesson of history is that while bloody and messy wars of liberation and revolution are often unavoidable and necessary, you can accomplish remarkable change just as assertively and even more effectively through peaceful protest, through an uprising of the masses in passive resistance to evil that makes your people ungovernable by oppressors, accompanied by education programs, protests without weapons or violence, heated debate in the media, and winning the arguments with truth and reason from a moral high ground. Historically black Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, awarded President Nelson, of all people, their first Gandhi King Mandela Peace Prize apparently in return for a hefty enough chunk of tithing money to fund scholarships and so on for students. The thing about Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela is that they predominantly advocated resistance to oppression and regime change through mass peaceful protest. To be historically accurate, though, Mandela and a lot of the African National Congress leadership were imprisoned for creating a violent terrorist wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, in 1961, when he gave up hope of passive resistance to apartheid working. Despite initially naively or disingenuously claiming it would never kill people and only damage infrastructure, it ended up injuring 483 people and murdering at least 63 in its bombing campaign, and torturing and executing its prisoners. Umkhonto Sizwe cost the ANC and the liberation movement a lot of its moral high ground compared to the white racist South African government committing the same atrocities on a much larger scale. The least complicated heroes in history to look to in liberation struggles, as they navigated very complicated situations of extreme danger and injustice by brutal regimes, are those who manage to hold it together and persist with non-violent resistance to tyrants. When they did, they brought about astonishing changes. But they did not do it by gently whispering in the ear of the people abusing power. Peaceful protest and resistance is not quiet. They opposed bravely, resolutely, publicly, loudly, and at whatever the cost, just like Jesus. They mobilized the masses and made the changes happen, not the subtle diplomats. In episode 11A, I explored in detail how the whole premise of Bruce and Marie Hafen's Faith is Not Blind book and project, trying to guide people in faith crisis to stay as active Latter-day Saints, falls on its face at the first hurdle by intentionally ignoring and downplaying the whole truth about the church's racism in particular, as well as many other things, and basically saying, put all your concerns about uncomfortable truths back on a shelf and ignore them, and just trust the many other people who are faithful. Trust what Leo Tolstoy called the spirit of the army, even though in reality most of the LDS soldiers have deserted the army, including 80% of its young people in recent decades. The deep irony that makes this all additionally farcical is that it was literally Bruce Hafen himself who introduced the data report about losing 80% of the kids to the apostles in 2008 in the film leaked to Mormon leaks. But he still went for a logical fallacy so big and so common it has a long list of different names for the same thing. The appeal to popularity, the argument from majority, the argument from consensus, the bandwagon fallacy, the appeal to common belief, the democratic fallacy, the mob appeal, and the appeal to masses. The idea that because most people or a lot of people believe something, it must therefore be true. In this episode, I will be arguing enthusiastically for democracy being a major solution for most of our problems. And the Book of Mormon teaches that in a democracy, most of the people are right most of the time, and definitely more reliable at decision making than individual kings. Mosiah 29 is a remarkable chapter of the Book of Mormon. It describes a pivotal moment when King Mosiah's princely sons have given up their right to inherit the throne and instead devoted their lives to converting their enemies, the Lamanites, to Christ at great personal risk. And King Mosiah wisely chooses to teach his people that democracy is a far more sensible system of government than putting so much responsibility and burden on a king, who too often is corrupted by that power and takes the whole nation in a bad direction. If you are feeling skeptical that an ancient American kingdom shifted suddenly from monarchy to a very modern-sounding democracy around 100 BC, remember that the Greek city-state of Athens had already done the same very successfully 400 years earlier. Whether or not you take the Book of Mormon as literal history, the big ideas here are just as relevant to power, leadership, decision-making, and accountability in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as they are to secular government. Latter-day Saints are encouraged to apply the lessons of the Scriptures to our own contemporary situations, and there is a lot to apply here. The main ideas King Mosiah reasons for here are that all the people should be involved and responsible for decisions that are made. That putting all the power in the hands of one person risks their personal weaknesses and errors, making everything worse for the whole population. And specifically that in a far better system of rule by elected judges, the chief judge or head of state, the first chosen being Alma the Younger, who served as both head of the state government and leader of the church, should not be above the law. Lower-ranking judges who drifted from the laws and principles of the democratic state of legally protected freedoms could be tried and disciplined by higher-ranking judges, and the higher-ranking judges going off the rails could be judged and disciplined by a team of lower-ranking judges. This system of democracy and accountability is very closely replicated in the rules of the Constitution for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, prescribed in the Doctrine and Covenants, especially the verses about everything being done by the common consent vote of all the members in Doctrine and Covenants 26 and other places, and in great detail in D&C 107. 107 describes how the first presidency, quorum of 12 apostles, first quorum of 70, and stake high councils are all equal in authority, and how any bishop can convene a common council of 12 high priests to put the president of the church on trial, because he is not above the rules and laws everyone else has to follow. I said at the start of this episode that the two root causes of the LDS Church going off the rails now are teaching the Pharisee rather than Christian religion, and dictatorship by gerontocracy, and putting all the decision-making power without accountability into the hands of the most elderly President Prophet, in violation of the Church's constitution. As we listen to the words of Mosiah 29, I invite you to consider how powerfully they speak to our present troubles. How dictator presidents surround themselves with their relatives and friends and tear up the laws and doctrines taught by their predecessors with impunity, like President Nelson has in countless matters, from rewriting the temple endowment to dramatically throwing his immediate predecessor's I'm a Mormon campaign under the bus and redefining it as a victory for Satan. Mosiah 29 reminds us that Mormonism already has in its scriptures the tools to heal itself and get this stuff right. Quote, "And behold, now I say unto you, ye cannot dethrone an iniquitous king, save it be through much contention, and the shedding of much blood. For behold, he has his friends in iniquity, and he keepeth his guards about him, and he teareth up the laws of those who have reigned in righteousness before him, and he trampleth under his feet the commandments of God. And he enacteth laws, and sendeth them forth among his people, yea, laws after the manner of his own wickedness. And whosoever doth not obey his laws, he causeth to be destroyed. And whosoever doth rebel against him, he will send his armies against them to war. And if he can, he will destroy them. And thus an unrighteous king doth pervert the ways of all righteousness. And now behold, I say unto you, it is not expedient that such abominations should come upon you. Therefore, choose you by the voice of this people judges, that ye may be judged according to the laws which have been given you by our fathers, which are correct, and which are given them by the hand of the Lord. Now it is not common that the voice of the people desireth anything contrary to that which is right, but it is common for the lesser part of the people to desire that which is not right. Therefore this shall ye observe, and make it your law, to do your business by the voice of the people. And if the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he hath hitherto visited this land. And now, if ye have judges, and they do not judge you according to the law which has been given, ye can cause that they may be judged of a higher judge. If your higher judges do not judge righteous judgment, ye shall cause that a small number of your lower judges should be gathered together, and they shall judge your higher judges according to the voice of the people. And I command you to do these things in the fear of the Lord. And I command you to do these things, and that ye have no king, that if these people commit sins and iniquities, they shall be answered upon their own heads. For behold, I say unto you, the sins of many people have been caused by the iniquities of their kings. Therefore their iniquities are answered upon the heads of their kings. And now I desire that this inequality should be no more in this land, especially among this my people. But I desire that this land be a land of liberty, and every man may enjoy his rights and privileges alike, so long as the Lord sees fit that we may live and inherit the land, yea, even as long as any of our posterity remains upon the face of the land. And many more things did King Mosiah write unto them, unfolding unto them all the trials and troubles of a righteous king, yea, all the travails of soul for their people, and also all the murmurings of the people to their king. And he explained it all unto them. And he told them that these things ought not to be, but that the burden should come upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. And he also unfolded unto them all the disadvantages they laboured under, by having an unrighteous king to rule over them. Yea, all his iniquities and abominations, and all the wars and contentions and bloodshed, and the stealing, and the plundering, and the committing of whoredoms, and all manner of iniquities which cannot be enumerated, telling them that these things ought not to be, that they were expressly repugnant to the commandments of God. And now it came to pass, after King Mosiah had sent these things forth among the people, they were convinced of the truth of his words. Therefore they relinquished their desires for a king, and became exceedingly anxious that every man should have an equal chance throughout all the land. Yea, and every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins. Therefore it came to pass that they assembled themselves together in bodies throughout the land, to cast in their voices concerning who should be their judges, to judge them according to the law which had been given them. And they were exceedingly rejoiced because of the liberty which had been granted unto them. And they did wax strong in love towards Mosiah. Yea, they did esteem him more than any other man, for they did not look upon him as a tyrant who was seeking for gain, yea, for that lucre which doth corrupt the soul. For he had not exacted riches of them, neither had he delighted in the shedding of blood, but he had established peace in the land, and he had granted unto his people that they should be delivered from all manner of bondage. Therefore they did esteem him, yea, exceedingly, beyond measure. Close quote. To have a prophet increasingly rather than decreasingly respected and loved in this world, he needs to trust, liberate, and empower other people rather than his own towering narcissistic ego. The key is democracy and separation of power at every level of authority within the church. But the additional layer of error in the Hathens putting all of their testimony rescuing eggs in this spirit of the army appeal to popularity basket is that LDS Mormonism fails as a sensible choice on that basis. Globally, only a microscopic minority of the 8,000 million people alive today have decided to show an interest in Mormonism at all. And of the 17 million baptized members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, only about 20% of them have stuck with it. So the first component of my rational calculation is that gently nudging the church to change, or trying to persuade people to stay in the boat because of loyalty or feelings, or blindly trusting the minority of Latter-day Saints who are still active, is not rational. It ignores the true scale of the problems, and clearly isn't working. Softly approaches have failed. The second data point in my reality check is that the other reason for hope and reform that gets discussed and yearned for the most in nuanced and post-Mormon communities is that a savior apostle will miraculously become the president of the church and fix everything. Usually Dieter Uchtdorf looking at the current line of succession. This hope is based on not questioning the assumption that the only way to change the leadership of the church is to have someone younger with a more modern and realistic outlook rise through the ranks of the Q15, and in a sea of backward looking fuddy duddies, their brief reign will be transformative. They will enact the wish list of the reforming progressives, apologize for the racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, insist that the gospel topics essays and rough stone rolling and the other even more accurate and honest accounts of our religion's journey are the mainstream Sunday school curriculum until everyone is up to speed on new Mormon history, and then ordain women, end worthiness interviews, and introduce same-sex temple marriages. Even if someone like that does start out as an apostle, by the time they actually become president, they have been ruthlessly indoctrinated and conditioned by the protocols and traditions of how the apostles in our church function to silence themselves and submit to a consensus always deferring to the oldest men in the room, and severely disciplined by demotion, like Dieter Uchtdorf was when he was evicted from the first presidency for being too progressive. If Dieter was going to be the change, he would have radically transformed the still totally dysfunctional missionary system and got a new Preach My Gospel published within months, rather than the years he has taken since being put in charge of that. It would have fresh new ideas in it, which this new version certainly does not, and he would never have contradicted all his earlier appeals for being realistic and honest about church history, and people having valid reasons for leaving, urging people to doubt their doubts, instead of actually following them through and enacting solutions for all the things that make people doubt the credibility of this church. An individual apostle reformer doesn't have enough power in such a rigid system to make the changes needed. And the best hope for that we have had for generations has already been intimidated into going native in the ivory tower. We could get behind the religion and worldview of young Uchtdorf, but President Uchtdorf will be an elderly, empty shell of what he once was by the time he ascends the velvet throne. And even if he did make all those changes, the prophet after him, with a very long tenure because of his comparative youth, will be David Bednar, who will be the most control-freaky prophet we have had since Brigham Young. So a brief Prague spring under appropriately Czechoslovakian Uchtdorf will be quickly stamped out by a return of the evil empire of Darth Susan Bednar's husband and his homophobic stormtroopers like Kevin Pearson and Jorg Klebingat, the Desnat Goebbels. Also consider for a moment how pathetic it is that a community of millions of grown adults with families and professional careers, who are on the one hand told they are all actual gods in training, have also been taught and internalized the disempowering idea that their only hope for their church fixing its problems is to sit and do nothing until one of the super elite godmen running the church with their relatives and close friends happens to look their way and show a bit of empathy for their concerns. Seriously, it's like living in a Bronze Age monarchy. So, to recap, the first two data points of my rational calculation are that the softly softly approach doesn't work and never has. The changes it brings are far too small and far too slow and rarely even completed. The church did not actually abandon polygamy when it seemed to be taking the radical step of abandoning polygamy. The leaders carried on practicing it in secret for decades and continued temple polygamy today, including two members of the First Presidency. Now Henry B. Eyring's wife has sadly died. We will see if he decides to join Dallin and Russell's Eternal Polygamy Club. The church did not actually abandon racism when it seemed to be taking the radical step of abandoning racism in 1978. They never apologized for it. They never dealt with the scriptures justifying it. And they are doubling down now on teaching that racist segregation of the priesthood and temple ordinances was God's commandment all along, as I have been documenting in many previous episodes. The whole system and its apostolic guardians don't actually want any change at all to happen, and when they are forced to change, they only do it half-heartedly, and in many ways get worse. They have discontinued women's sessions of General Conference, and the last General Conference, once again, only had 3 women speaking in it, despite all their forced nonsense about women's voices being vitally important that they clearly don't really believe. These sexist pigs have learnt and changed nothing substantial in the last few decades, and in their overweening patriarchal arrogance seem to now be baiting the feminists to do anything about this, as they further erode the visibility and influence of women in the church at the highest levels. And expecting a savior prophet to sweep in just in time before the church entirely disappears and fix everything is unrealistic and has never happened and never will as the system currently works. Gradual change and sudden saviors are futile and false hopes, and thus a complete waste of time. The third data point to factor into the equation for saving the church is that every significant improvement that has pushed the church to break through the resistance and inertia of the apostolic dictatorship has come because of assertive activism by dissidents speaking up from within the membership of the church and political and journalistic pressure from outside the church in wider society, shaming the church with truth and reason to make reforms. The fourth data point in the equation to save the church is that we already have within the written constitution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints all the authority and specific procedures we need to hold leaders accountable and replace them if they are failing or criminally unworthy of the responsibility, including the president of the church. And the fifth and final data point is that time to make the changes in time to stop the church entirely disappearing has very nearly run out. We are not 1 minute before the midnight of Jesus Christ's second coming. We are 1 minute before the midnight of the church functionally ceasing to exist and have a future in pretty much every area of the world after all those decades of effort and expense to convert people across the globe. So, the TLDR, too long, didn't read version of Series 11 of the Mormon Civil War podcast is 1. Gradual incremental steps of reform are too slow and don't make enough of a difference. 2. The hope for a radically transforming savior president of the church is futile and never happens. 3. Assertive public activism and journalism, getting the truth out there and shaming the leaders into reforms is the only catalyst for change that has worked so far in our 200-year history. Number 4. All the solutions to our problems are already present in LDS scriptures and the more sensible and Christian teachings of its past and present prophets. So this church has the potential to redeem itself and flourish rather than having to leave it and start a new church to salvage its potential to be a significant and helpful world religion that is a net benefit to the world and its members. Number 5, the time is now. There is an extreme urgency, as at current rates of decline, the Church only has 5 years left before its active membership falls below thresholds of sustainability from which it can rebuild and recover. That threshold has probably already been passed here in the UK, in Europe, and many other regions. So, think big. Take action far outside your previous comfort zone and expectations of what your membership of the church would involve and look like, and become a proactive activist and advocate for change if you can. The church has literally nothing to lose from you doing this. It is already doomed without change. The ward and stake that you are going to upset and worry and make uncomfortable literally won't be there anymore in 5 or 10 years. But what you do to step up could be essential to giving it a chance to go on. If enough of us used the church's own systems of accountability and the transfer of power, we could replace the entire leadership of the church in a week and unleash a process of common consent consultation and voting that would accelerate the reforms that are totally unavoidable to make if we are to hold on to our children and have a next generation of Latter-day Saints to be this church in a world that still really needs the better things we could be offering it. So, memorize the game plan with me. 1. Softly, softly sucks. 2. Savior prophets never happen. 3. Activism works. 4. Mormonism already has the tools to heal itself. 5. It's now or never. And despite the costs, it is far more fun to be a rebel reformer than a stressed out worker drone whose soul and hope in Christ is buried under a heavy mountain of shame and futile church busy work that is not working. You really aren't necessarily choosing the path of most genuine happiness by continuing to scrub the decks of the sinking ship. If you really want to devote your time and energy to this church's well-being, there are much more productive ways to do it. If you have been informed and convinced enough to believe this and are ready to step up and get going, off you go. You know what to do and how to do it. If you don't feel quite ready and confident enough to be this kind of a proactive reformer yet, keep listening. All will be made clear. It is this kind of realization and game plan that makes me and the people who think like me the most dangerous threat to the current leadership regime. How exciting! Institutions are always more terrified and threatened by insiders pointing out how their power and systems are illegitimate impositions according to the institution's own internal and foundational rules than they are of people setting up competing institutions who can be more easily demonized as the other the enemy, and mostly ignored. The paranoia that the real threat to your ill-gotten power and privileges is sitting on the pew next to you, or in the potential of the sheep you have bamboozled, suddenly finding out that you've been lying to them all along, makes illegitimate leaders very nervous and keep a very tight grip on what their victims are allowed to hear or think. They live with the ever-present risk that when the masses realize how they have been breaking the rules and manipulating them, it's game over for their rule, and they are likely to be quickly deposed and replaced by someone hopefully more honest and suitable for the responsibility of leadership. Historically, the most persistent, brutal, and bitter conflicts in religious communities have not been between different religions, but between factions within the same religion. The threat they pose is too close to home. It is too easy for people following what you are certain is the correct way to believe and live your religion to just make a few changes to their beliefs and lifestyle and end up in that other faction, for better or worse, and no longer give their devotion, money, and free labor to you. Much easier than totally changing to an entirely different religion. This is why Jesus described in Matthew 10:35 his internal transformation of Judaism as a necessary but highly divisive movement that would turn family members against each other, the tragedy of all civil wars. Quote, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household." Close quote. Remember that scripture next time you feel anxious about being seen as divisive or contentious if you speak the truth or raise legitimate concerns in your Sunday lessons or conversations with leaders. The most bitter and ongoing conflicts have been between Catholic and Protestant Christians, which entirely defines the divided and often violent society my father grew up in Northern Ireland, and Sunni and Shia Muslims, still playing out in the hot and cold war across the Middle East between the Muslim superpowers of Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran. But remember, please, that some civil wars have been the noblest wars. The English Civil War preserved democracy from aristocratic dictatorship. The American Civil War ended the abomination of slavery. You just have to work out which side is the right one to fight for. There are literally more than 100 complex and very entangled dysfunctions that have all contributed to the orgy of self-destruction and collapse occurring in the once growing and thriving institution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The more members realize this and learn about the dysfunctions, the more likely they become to quite reasonably give up any hope of being able to influence any change and reforms to address these problems. The vast majority who have this epiphany walk away with a heavy heart and lots of trauma and betrayal to process, and when they do, or even start to talk about their growing concerns, the threat level paranoia about schism and apostasy kicks in, and usually the first and only response to their concerns by church members is panic and threats rather than empathy and support. Despite this painful disappointment, the great news for the people who leave and their families is that eventually most of them reach a point where they feel significantly freer and mentally healthier without the crushing weight of entirely unnecessary guilt and futile busy work the church piles on its members, like the mountain, as Dieter Uchtdorf perfectly described in his It Works Wonderfully talk in October 2015 General Conference.
But I also recognize that there are some who have a less than fulfilling experience, who feel that their membership in the church sometimes isn't quite what they had hoped for. This saddens me because I know firsthand how the gospel can invigorate and renew one's spirit, how it can fill our hearts with hope and our minds with light. I know for myself how the fruits of the gospel of Jesus Christ can transform lives from the ordinary and dreary to the extraordinary and sublime. But why does it seem to work better for some than for others? What is the difference between those whose experience in the church fills their souls with songs of redeeming love and those who feel something is lacking? As I have pondered these questions, a flood of thoughts came to mind. Today, I'd like to share two. First, are we making our discipleship too complicated? This beautiful gospel is so simple a child can grasp it, yet so profound and complex that it will take a lifetime, even an eternity, of study and discovery to fully understand it. But sometimes we take the beautiful lily of God's truth and gild it with layers upon layers of man-made good ideas, programs, and expectations. Each one by itself might be helpful and appropriate for a certain time and circumstance. But when they are laid on top of each other, they can create a mountain of sediment that becomes so thick and heavy that we risk losing sight of that precious flower we once loved so dearly. Therefore, as leaders, we must strictly protect the church and the gospel in its purity and plainness and avoid putting unnecessary burdens on our members. And all of us, as members of the church, we need to make a conscientious effort to devote our energy and time to the things that truly matter, while uplifting our fellow man and building the kingdom of God.
I was just about to hit render on the edit of this episode when something remarkable and perfect to include here went viral in ex-Mormon Reddit. A shaft of the light of integrity and courage was beamed into the post-Mormon firmament from my beloved Deep South where I served my mission. A bishop in Mississippi, like increasing numbers of other experienced and faithful local leadership class Latter-day Saints, has realized that he cannot face another day facilitating the church's damaging dysfunctions, or put his own children through the harmful brainwashing he went through at their age. And he did not go quietly. He spoke with carefully worded power and sensitivity to his ward to announce and to some extent explain his resignation from the bishop role, and allowed his brother to share film of his speech in ex-Mormon Reddit. Perhaps not realizing how fast something like that goes viral, the huge response spooked them and it was taken down quickly. But they reinstated it, and today the bishop shared a follow-up video message thanking everyone for their support and being a bit more specific about his reasons for resigning. And it seems highly likely that he is leaving the church and not just his calling. It is very difficult to make the transition from serving leader of a congregation with all its overwhelming sense of responsibility and duty of care to its members, particularly the young, to join the ranks of people calling out the church's harm rather than making excuses for it and encouraging loyal devotion to the leaders. There aren't many yet who have had that much bravery and determination, particularly to do so in a way intended to speak to the larger community and encourage reality checks and reforms rather than disappearing quietly and privately. But he has joined the growing ranks of those who have, like my sister's bishop Steve Blore did in Helston Ward in Cornwall, and the serving bishops who have appeared on Mormon Stories to voice their concerns and trust crisis from Mexico and Australia, and Area 70 Hans Mattsson in Sweden, and other men and women all over the world. My prognosis has for a long time been that the only chance of the church changing fast enough is if a significant number of members in local leadership roles like him stand up and speak up against the abuses of power and our young people's well-being going on, in order to truly protect and care for their flocks and their own children. And this man seems to have showed the way to do that with determination and sensitivity, wording things carefully so as not to be unnecessarily painful and distressing for his congregation, but also not shying away from being real and urging particularly the young people to hold to their integrity and resist the church's efforts to mentally control them into losing their trust in their own moral compass and becoming sheep.
2.5 years ago, when I was called to be bishop, President Richardson came to my home and sat down on my couch with my wife and I and issued the call. When we left the home, I was quite emotional, but I remember shutting the door behind him. And the words from section 121 came in my mind. It is the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they give a little authority as they suppose, they begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. And the Spirit said, don't you ever do it. And I've thought about it and I never have. I was talking with Brother Torres this morning. You know, the word Israel means we who wrestle with God. I want to tell you about a wrestle I've had. Ernest Hemingway once said the most painful thing is losing yourself in the process of loving something or someone too much and forgetting that you're special too. I owe it to my Word family to hear it from me. I've asked to be released. Not because of some sin, not because I'm hiding something. Not at all. There's just a few things that I've been required to do that I personally cannot morally stand by. I can't. So I need to step down for me and my family's well-being. It's not been easy, but I feel in many ways I'm failing the Word. I know this is hard, I understand. But I have to be true to my feelings. I've been angry. Every Sunday people look at me and they're like, man, Bishop, something wrong. I can't do that to you. I won't. Because that turns to anger and bitterness and malevolence. I've written down a few things, if it's okay if I could just share my thoughts. Sometimes due to church culture, we feel that we're not supposed to turn down or step away from a calling. I wish I had known it was okay to say to myself, I'm not okay. I'm not as strong as I thought I was. To seek excellence is important. I don't. That's my life. I seek excellence. More, doing more, being successful. It's so much more important to know that you're okay. And I haven't been okay. This calling, guys, it is so hard. You have to keep everything to yourself. builds up, and it is exhausting. And it has broken me. I didn't have good parents. I wish they would have told me I was enough. But never have. That whether I had worth or not wasn't contingent on how I acted. We are not loved for what we do or what we are going to do. We are loved for who we are. Not an expectation, but who we are. And to feel love for who you are is the most sacred kind of love. It's a gift that we have the opportunity to give to ourselves. If I could just say one more thing towards the youth, because they are the reason I've stayed as long as I have. I love them. If there's ever injustice in the world, young men, young women, there's not many here, but listen. If there's ever injustice in the world, fight it. If there's ever a bully somewhere, stand up to it. And if you ever have something to say, say it. Just say it. Don't fear. Fear. Get rid of fear. And if you don't have any, and if you don't want to do that, that's okay. You're still enough. Instead of judgment, choose compassion. Instead of division, see everyone as you living a different life. And remember, maybe I'll say it like Alma, and remember, if you're enough, everyone else is too. You are redeemed. You are always forgiven, no matter what. Jesus was a man who came to know the Christ. Seek Christ. Seek only Christ. I realize a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions. I do. Join the club. So do we. This has not been easy for my family. This has not been easy at all. It hasn't been easy for anybody. And this is not going to continue to be easy. But we want you to know that we love you. I told Jeff this morning, I said, if we get called for tornado work, he's still riding shotgun. I'm just not going to wear the silly shirt. And I know Brother Bailey has prepared quite a bit for the next hour, so I will sit down, but I want you to know I love you. This is very hard for me. I know it's hard for you. But I know it's the right thing to do. Someone else who's better suited will do the job. So with that being said, let's close out the meeting. We'll do it. It's kind of ironic. I sing hymn number 227, There is Sunshine in My Soul Today. After which we'll have a benediction, and I totally forgot who it was who was supposed to give the prayer. Somebody know what the sound paper. Brother Oscar. I knew that. After which Brother Oscar will give benediction.
Good morning, everybody. Exmo Reddit, Mormon Reddit. This is all fairly new to me. We have to remember that these people are just simply us who haven't yet learned the truth. I don't know what the answer is. Part of me thinks if we stop talking about it and just love them, maybe that's the answer. Maybe we quit dogging Joseph and Brigham. Those people have heard it. They know. They've just been brainwashed. They can call it whatever they want, but that's what it is. But our family's doing okay. We have been struggling so much. We've taken advantage of friends in the church to help us cope with the realization of what we've come to know. So this affects so many people. And people are so tender. And I don't want to hurt people. Both on either side. Both Mormon and non-Mormon. But just so you know, yesterday was extremely heavy. For me, yes, but more for my wife and my kids. We're in Mississippi. There's no Exmo group in Mississippi. My kids are homeschooled, so their friends, I pray that their friends will remain true to them, regardless of what they believe. But I just won't subject my children to the programming anymore. No more FSY trips. No more camps. No, that's where they abused me. We're not going to do that. Things are changing. The world is changing. Don't believe the wars and the rumors you hear in the news. Yes, they're real. But that's all fog to put fear in the hearts and minds of the people. Look upward. Seek the higher self. That is where Christ is. He doesn't come from the clouds. He comes from within. We are so grateful for you guys. On both sides, I can't believe the love I've seen. Yeah, there's some assholes out there that just want to be negative, and that's fine. Let them have it. I've been that guy. But thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for the love that you've made my family feel in a time where they felt nothing. You don't know what you've done for me. So I love you all. I pray that we may find peace. Y'all have a wonderful day.
A couple of years ago, I was scrolling through Facebook posts and came across one of the wonderful illustrated quotes by post-Mormon illustrator Laura Randall. It features a Deseret beehive with the words, "It is our compliance that sustains this dystopia that is meant to be Zion." I immediately thought, I really agree with that. I wonder who said it, and looked at the small print. It was me! It was one of the funniest and awesomest moments in my podcasting life in this geeky corner of the Mormon vineyard. I literally couldn't agree more. I messaged Laura to compliment her on her wonderful skills from one artist to another, and her wise and sophisticated discernment in who to quote. Bless her heart, she made a delightful mini-movie about her work to include in a presentation about Mormon art I gave at UK Sunstone that I hope to be able to put out as an episode if the Latter-day Saints can just take a break with the murdering and the stealing for a bit. Amazing Mississippi bishop man has clearly realized that it is our compliance that sustains this dystopia that is meant to be Zion, and he and his wife have decided not to comply with it anymore. The Zion of the LDS Church in exile just got a little larger, and the dystopia just lost another of its brightest and best. I suggest the next step is going to have to be even harder. The bishops and the lady leaders are going to need to stay and vote opposed rather than just voting with their feet, and give others the courage to stand on their holy ground and resist the Pharisee dictatorship from the inside. Momentum is building, and eventually it will happen. I just hope it doesn't happen too late, if the church does have enough positive potential to be worth saving. Those who don't want to leave and choose to stay in the face of this overwhelming cluster moriankama of failing, quote, man-made good ideas, programs and expectations, close quote, make that work with a coping mechanism that is a kind of zombified state of despair that I see in most of the ward and stake leaders I talk to now. They know it's going wrong, but they see no way to make change happen, so they stop paying much attention to the larger picture of collapse and the teachings of the general authorities, despite having to base nearly all their Sunday lessons and talks on general conference talks these days. They don't pay much attention to general conference when it actually happens, certainly not as much as the dissidents do, ironically. A recent case in point I experienced was the Fast and Testimony meeting following the October 2023 General Conference. After my usual long weekend of listening intently to every word and joining Nemo the Mormon's podcast to co-present two of his live General Conference halftime review shows, analysing the key messaging and obscure references in the talks we had just heard, I was intrigued to see what impact General Conference had had on my ward. As usual, it became clear that very few people had listened to more than a couple of the talks, and no one was getting any particular message from them apart from Rusty's new slogan, Think Celestial. The delightful meme that had been doing the rounds of the Bloggernacle comparing an LDS family zonked out asleep on their sofa while watching conference to critics scrutinizing every word seems to have been pretty accurate. Maybe more church members are making the cynical calculation that since they are going to spend the next 6 months being dragged through dozens of the conference talks in almost every priesthood and relief society lesson and sacrament talk, they can wait until then to find out what was in them, rather than give up an entire weekend listening to them live as well. The take home points for me from President Nelson's pre recorded and devastating closing talk of the conference were that he totally U turned his super inclusive plea for tolerance and kindness in April conference, when he was still trying to justify his Peacemaker Award, and this time pleaded with everyone to never trust and take counsel from unbelievers because they are Satanists teaching the quote, doctrines of devils, close quote, which would include not taking counsel from your parents, your friends, your school teachers, your spouse, professional experts, or your doctor if they aren't believers, in whatever Rusty's version of Mormonism is this week. He condemned most of our ward's families and all of our non-member friends to an eternity in a lesser kingdom with no contact with their spouses and families and empty seats at the family table of the righteous who make it to the celestial kingdom in a reprise of his infamous sad heaven vision for the afterlife if you are not all sealed in the temple and exactly obedient to his covenant path before you die. And most startling of all, he seemed to restore the doctrine of the TK smoothie, the terrestrial and telestial kingdom resurrected body with no genitals, like Ken and Barbie dolls taught by previous prophets. To be specific, Joseph Fielding Smith as an apostle in his book Doctrines of Salvation, Volume 2, in which he said rather recklessly, in light of the absolute shitstorm in the church these days around gender identity, quote, in both of these kingdoms there will be changes in the bodies and limitations. They will not have the power of increase, neither the power or nature to live as husbands and wives, for this will be denied them, and they cannot increase. Those who receive the exaltation in the celestial kingdom will have the quote, continuation of the seeds forever, close quote. They will live in the family relationship. In the terrestrial and the telestial kingdoms, there will be no marriage. Those who enter there will remain, quote, separate and singly, close quote, forever. Some of the functions in the celestial body will not appear in the terrestrial body, neither in the telestial body, and the power of procreation will be removed. I take it that men and women will, in these kingdoms, be just what the so-called Christian world expects us all to be, neither man nor woman, merely immortal beings, having received the resurrection. Close quote. This is rather startling, as the always brilliant Missed in Sunday School meme factory points out, compared to the equally certain statement in President Gordon B. Hinckley's Family Proclamation that, quote, gender is an essential characteristic of individual, premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose, close quote. Once again, the wild contradictions in pronouncements like these make clear that these apostles and prophets are just making up total nonsense that they teach as eternal truths about God and reality and the afterlife on the fly, based entirely on what seems right to them personally in the context of their times. And it could all be flipped on its head in a later official proclamation, then brought back again. What else can Russell Nelson mean when he talks about different bodies in different afterlife kingdoms than this doctrine of having no reproductive equipment or capabilities if you don't reach celestial as well as thinking celestial? The eternal gender identity assertion in the Family Proclamation just went up in flames. He is a disaster as a theologian, and never seems to know enough to realize the bear traps he keeps blundering into, or the implications of what he says. Since we are meant to prioritize what is being taught by the living prophets over the dead ones, and even over scriptures, as we will hear Elder Haney teach in General Conference in a later episode. But don't worry, President Nelson is going to reassure us that they are the only reliable source of information or people whose counsel we should trust, because they are believing prophets, seers, and revelators of God, just like those men he keeps throwing under the bus and contradicting were.
Because of Jesus Christ's infinite atonement, our Heavenly Father's plan is a perfect plan. An understanding of God's fabulous plan takes the mystery out of life and the uncertainty out of our future. It allows each of us to choose how we will live here on earth and where we will live forever. Today, to assist you to qualify for the rich blessings Heavenly Father has for you, I invite you to adopt the practice of thinking celestial. Thinking celestial means being spiritually minded. Your choices today will determine 3 things: where you will live throughout all eternity, the kind of body with which you will be resurrected, and those with whom you will live forever. So, think celestial. In my first message as president of the church, I encourage you to begin with the end in mind. This means making the celestial kingdom your eternal goal, and then carefully considering where each of your decisions while here on earth will place you in the next world. The Lord has clearly taught that only men and women who are sealed as husband and wife in the temple and who keep their covenants will be together throughout the eternities. He said, quote, all covenants, contracts, bonds, obligations, oaths, vows, performances, connections, associations, or expectations that are not made and entered into and sealed in the Holy Spirit of promise have an end when men are dead. Close quote. Thus, if we unwisely choose to live telestial laws now, we are choosing to be resurrected with a telestial body. We are choosing not to live with our families forever. So, my dear brothers and sisters, how and where and with whom do you want to live forever? You get to choose. When you make choices, I invite you to take the long view, an eternal view. Put Jesus Christ first, because your eternal life is dependent upon your faith in Him and in His atonement. It is also dependent upon your obedience to His laws. Obedience paves the way for a joyful life for you today and a grand, eternal reward tomorrow. When you are confronted with a dilemma, think celestial. When tested by temptation, think celestial. When life or loved ones let you down, think celestial. When someone dies prematurely, think celestial. When someone lingers with a devastating illness, think celestial. When the pressures of life crowd in upon you, think celestial. As you recover from an accident or injury, as I am doing now, think celestial. As you focus on thinking celestial, expect to encounter opposition. As you think celestial, you will find yourself avoiding anything that robs you of your agency. Any addiction, be it gaming, gambling, debt, drugs, alcohol, anger, pornography, sex, or even food, offends God. Why? Because your obsession becomes your God. You look to it rather than to Him for solace. If you struggle with an addiction, seek the spiritual and professional help you need. Please do not let an obsession rob you of your freedom to follow God's fabulous plan. When someone you love attacks truth, think celestial and don't question your testimony. The Apostle Paul prophesied that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. There is no end to the adversary's deceptions. Please be prepared. Never take counsel from those who do not believe. Seek guidance from voices you can trust, from prophets, seers, and revelators, and from the whisperings of the Holy Ghost, who will show unto you the things what ye should do.
All my ward members seem to have noticed in this talk, if they had listened to it at all, was think celestial. and then made up their own, much more cheerful meaning for it. Definitely more cheerful than what President Nelson said he meant by the phrase, which was, make sure all your family members get married in the temple and then do exactly everything I tell you to, or you will never see them again after you die, and they will have their genitals removed, because they won't need them. In the lesser kingdom, their resurrected bodies are going to. And if anyone tells you this doctrine is cruel and crazy, don't trust them, because you are living in a world where everyone but me is controlled by Satan and lying to you with their devil doctrines. Lovely people whose families he had just very specifically condemned to gonadless hell bore lovely testimonies about how much it meant to them that they will be together forever in heaven. I find this phenomenon maddeningly frustrating, but also, in a way, encouraging. It is frustrating because those people in their happy bubble think that those of us describing President Nelson's talk and overall worldview as a cruel and hopeless unchristian abomination are mad. They think we are intentionally distorting what he taught and making up negative anti Mormon nonsense about their lovely, sweet granddad prophet. It is encouraging because something in their brains has obviously told them that the darker things the prophet says really aren't compatible with their loving Christian Mormon God. So they deploy the happy Mormon mental filter. They literally don't even hear the nasty stuff and just hold on to the nice bits. And in this state of self censorship, thought stopping, and denial, it is far easier to continue testifying that this church is practically perfect in every way, and so is its beloved prophet, even Russell M. Nelson. I have noticed that even the more savvy local and regional leaders who can see that these teachings by the prophet are deeply problematic and making their jobs much harder have their own self soothing strategy of denial. It is to focus on the local rather than the global. Over the last few months, I've spoken at length with 3 stake presidents about the larger problems facing the church and threatening their flocks. In every case, it has been fascinating to watch them keep running to the small bubble of safety they have carved out in their local ministry. They keep turning the conversation to the good things they think they are doing in their little world, the young people they are mentoring, the moments of social and spiritual growth they see happening in congregations we both know are rapidly shrinking. They are just paddling away, doing their best as a small cog in the larger machine. They are trying to stay positive and to be kind and encouraging, to hold their remnants of once much larger awards and stakes together. They are trying to ignore the massive elephant in the room that it is all probably futile in the long run, because what is going on in the church as a whole, predominantly inflicted by the apostles' unhelpful and nasty priorities and incompetent management, is eventually going to override everything they are doing and drive those people away from active participation in the church in the long run anyway, regardless of how well these bishoprics and stake presidencies are ministering to them now. They've been so infantilized and disempowered, they can't see any other way to be while still holding on to the religion they love. They are stuck in a helpless limbo, waiting for something else, someone else but them, to make a miraculous change happen to the fortunes of the church and rescue it at the last minute. These days, more than ever, I see active members and local leaders get a glazed look in their eye and hush their voices and say something thought stopping and holy sounding like, "It is all in the hands of God. He directs the work. The prophet knows what he is doing. He can see the way ahead, even if we cannot." Or they take the even easier way out that most of their less informed congregants do, of entirely giving up hope of success and growth anymore. Their escape route from worrying about the church's collapse and the ultimate failure of most of their ministries is to nihilistically embrace the arrogant despair of assuming fervently that the end of the world must therefore literally be round the corner, and comfort themselves that they are the winners. The end is now, and they have endured to it. They have nobly proven their faithfulness and earned celestial glory when Jesus returns next Thursday by being the last 20 people still active in families and congregations of hundreds. The teeming billions on earth who didn't choose their covenant path deserve what is coming for them for rejecting the restoration they haven't even heard of. Their tiny, shrinking congregations are proof of their personal success and faithfulness, not their abject failure to fulfill the commission Joseph Smith taught that the church has been given to convert the teeming billions, or at least maybe more than 3 people a year in their ward boundaries that contain tens of thousands of decent, hard-working, non-Mormon families who ought to be ripe and ready for conversion. So, the almost impossible challenge, those very few of us who still have a growth mindset and see the potential for the LDS Church to really speak for Christianity, being credible and relevant in the 21st century information age, or at least reform enough to stop assertively harming so many of its members and retain its young people, is to try and convince these few remaining local leaders and followers that they have far more power to make the needed changes happen than they realize. To convince them that they could still make really big reforms happen in time to save the congregations they've spent their whole lives building and serving. To start with, the pathway to make these essential reforms happen that we map out for them needs to be simple and clear. There are still more than 100 dysfunctions to fix in every aspect of doctrine and every program of the church. The missionary system is a failing mess. The Sunday school lessons are dumbed down dreck now. The general conferences are a confusion of contradictions when you do actually listen carefully to all the talks. The finances of the church are a criminal obscenity. The youth program and worthiness interviews regime of control through shame is destructively abusive and drives 80% of the kids away before they finish their 20s. The social life of the church is dead. Its published histories are still riddled with lies. Its prophets and apostles lie and contradict themselves and each other. Every indicator of growth and health in the church as an institution and a community is falling fast. All of them. Baptisms per missionary, retention of converts, children of record being blessed, active membership, growth of the number of wards and stakes, temple ordinances, all flatlining or falling in real terms. Literally every single aspect of what this church does is broken and failing. All of those things will need dealing with sooner rather than later if the church is to be saved. But instead of getting lost and overwhelmed in all of those issues as individual concerns and discovering that the system of leadership, power, and decision making as currently organized are entirely incapable of fixing them, the first step that will open the door to dealing with them all is to change that system of leadership, power, and decision making. The system as it is has demonstrably failed. There can be no doubt about that. The misleading frenzy of announcing new temples to be built, and this week the creation of 36 more missions in 2024, are a paltry and illusory fig leaf trying to counter the weight of that decline. Temples only need money to build them now. Rusty has given up requiring a critical mass of active membership in a region first, so they haven't got the people to staff them and keep them open many days of the week. The new missions are being made by splitting larger ones or resurrecting dead ones. Even the official announcement admits this doesn't represent actually new mission areas. Quote, to accommodate rising numbers of missionaries now at more than 72,000, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will open 36 new missions on July the 1st, 2024. This puts the total number of missions at 450, the highest number in church history. Church leaders will create these new missions from existing missions. This adjustment will allow mission leaders to have more interaction with missionaries and more missionaries to be assigned to wards and branches. Close quote. So it would seem the missionary juggernaut in new territories like regions of Africa that has been touted as the last best hope for growth in the church has ground to a halt. And this is about using what they must realize now is a very temporary post-COVID rise in missionary numbers to consolidate what is already out there. The next paragraph is another classic of the inept mental gymnastic self-contradiction we have come to expect from the church newsroom. Quote, more missionaries are serving now than the 67,000 who were sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ just before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The increase is thanks in large part to the church president and prophet Russell M. Nelson's April 2022 call for more missionaries. Close quote. No, it isn't. You have a pretty small increase of 5,000 missionaries compared to the pre-pandemic total that was already falling because they were waiting for the pandemic to be over and deferring their service. I'll believe the prophet's call for more missionaries has been a game changer if that number is maintained or rises in the coming years, which seems highly unlikely. This announcement is hardly historic, as the movie accompanying this announcement proclaims. As you watch this 5-minute parade of delusional propaganda, remember that the number of missionaries serving before COVID was already falling, and that unprecedented percentages of our young members are going inactive before and after serving missions, and that they aren't having great success. The number of converts per missionary is still falling steadily, and retention is dire, with around 80% of converts going inactive soon after baptism, as we can see in our own regions, and is confirmed by the failure to add the number of congregations and stakes year on year that would be necessary if they were remaining active. Let the parade of lies commence.
I like to call it a seminal call for missionaries because it really did have an impact. We have 22 areas across the world, and 18 of them will have more missions.
This is a day to be celebrated by the church, by the members of the church, by all of us, because it shows this rising generation is not in such a crisis as some would make us believe. They are responding to the call of Jesus Christ through their prophet, and that makes me very happy.
In April 2022, our beloved prophet extended a prophetic invitation to serve a mission, particularly to the rising generation, and they accepted that call. They answered that call in abundance.
It really did have an impact. Every single month, the number of missionaries went up.
This, to me, is an outcropping of President Nelson's keen interest in our rising generation to be a part of what he calls the most important work of our day is to gather Israel on both sides of the veil. And they're doing it. They're putting in their applications. They're going out and serving.
He said in his April 2022 conference address that the gospel of Jesus Christ is the only enduring solution for peace. Now, we hear that statement and we think, oh yeah, there are a lot of wars. Well, yeah, I think it does speak to worldwide peace in that sense. But I think it also means at a very deep personal level that he brings healing and peace to the individual son or daughter of God.
When you look at our pre-pandemic numbers, we were at about 67,000, just over 67,000 missionaries. As of today, we're at 72,721. So that is a significant increase considering all that's been going on in the world. And so necessity demanded that we open new missions.
We're all heartbroken with what happened during COVID and the pandemic, and it stalled a lot of things, not just in the church, in the world, and with mankind. And so to see this particular area in the church of missionary service rebounding and even exceeding where we were prior to the pandemic is joyful. It's happy.
We're hoping that as these missions are created, the ratio of missionaries and mission leaders can be such that these mission leaders can have an ever developing and growing relationship with those missionaries as they lead and direct and comfort and strengthen the missionaries as they move forward.
I think it'll make the missionary experience so much more profound. You know, our desire, our hope, our prayer for every single one of these missionaries is that when they look back upon their missionary experience, that they will see that they experienced great joy. And not only the joy that comes from living the gospel, but also the joy that comes from sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I don't know how you can put a bad spin on this, to see our young people who are faced with so much in their lives choosing to serve Jesus Christ and go on these missions.
They want to serve. I think there's a love of the Savior that is very deep. I think that they look forward to these missions and they feel it a great privilege to serve. And they're having great success.
We have surveys and studies saying that Gen Z is turning away from God. And instead, our segment of Gen Z, members of the church, this rising generation, are stepping forward against countervailing winds and trends of the world, bucking those trends. They're stepping forward to serve God with a desire to serve Him and helping others come unto Him. And to me, that is a thrill.
They're remarkably good at talking to people. Some of them are just amazing with social media and technology. We've never had a generation that did better with that.
Getting visas has become a little more challenging throughout the world. And as we extend that period, that gives us more time for them to get started and applying for the visa. And we think that'll help them be able to leave without much delay.
It just gives more flexibility to a family, to a mom and a dad and a young person who's considering a mission.
I'm grateful for our prophet and the inspiration he received to express to the rising generation worldwide that the Lord needs every one of them to serve as a missionary. And I'm grateful that our missionaries, as I already expressed, have listened to the call, are coming forward to serve. And to me, it's a joy. The implications of this will be generational.
It may not be historical to subdivide existing missions, but this announcement is, however, hysterical to me. The Florida Tallahassee mission I served in was shut down in June 2019. But President Nelson announced a temple for Tallahassee 10 months later in April 2020. Well, guess what the list of new missions announced for 2024 includes? The Florida Tallahassee mission. You couldn't make it up in a church where the prophet sees round corners to the future. We are told in our scriptures in Isaiah and the Book of Mormon to judge a system by its fruits, like an olive tree or vineyard. We are taught to cut it down and burn it if it is not producing the fruit it should, and graft on healthier new branches to replace the dead wood in this agricultural metaphor that it was fashionable to reference constantly in talks and lessons many years ago. Funnily enough, The deadwood rotting away in the velvet thrones, who should have been pruned off and replaced long ago, don't seem so keen anymore for us to study that message these days. I wonder why. When you know the root causes of a mess, you can plan for a solution to clear it up and stop it happening again. The root causes of the mess in the LDS Church are organizational and doctrinal. The organizational system of being led by the oldest and longest serving apostles by default, who will nearly always be dying and often senile great grandfathers with no systems of accountability or restraints on their absolute power. This inevitably leads to a leadership and a decision making machine that is backward looking, incompetent, and entirely trapped in actioning the personal biases, obsessions, and whims of just one man. The doctrinal cause of the mess is simply believing and mostly practicing the dead control freak religion of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and all control freak dead religions and philosophies throughout human history, instead of the liberating and compassionate and truth led religion taught by Jesus Christ and the better foundational doctrines and scriptures of the Mormon restoration. There, it's that simple. Two root causes: leadership by gerontocracy with no accountability, Pharisee rather than Christian religiosity. And the great news is that we could fix them both far more easily than most Latter-day Saints realize. We have all been taught Christian Mormonism alongside Pharisee Mormonism. We just need to realize the difference and be given permission by Christian Mormon leaders to make the right choices. Every year, thousands of Latter-day Saints do realize the difference and choose Christian Mormonism. But when they realize that the dominant general authorities are now intractable Pharisee Mormons, and always will be, they can no longer declare allegiance to those leaders and their religion. So, to maintain their integrity and protect their children from the false and harmful doctrines and policies of the Pharisaical prophets and apostles, they leave. And they are so disgusted with how they have been manipulated and deceived, the vast majority resolve never to trust an organized religion again. How then do we get rid of and replace the Pharisee Mormon general authorities with Christian Mormon ones? We already have the opportunity and the authority to do that with our 4 yearly sustaining and opposing votes in 2 general conferences, ward conference, and the first of the 2 state conferences every year. The law of common consent already empowers every member of the church to do that. And Doctrine and Covenants 107 empowers every one of the 30,000 bishops in the world to discipline and, if necessary, release the president of the church. The solutions are in fact so simple, they seem too easy. And the general authorities have been working hard for over a century now to convince everyone that abandoning Pharisee Mormonism and replacing them is impossible, satanic, and unthinkable. That only God can hold them accountable and remove them from office and replace them. That their positions are divinely appointed and unquestionable. But it isn't impossible. We could do it all next week if we chose to. There are simple solutions to the complicated mess. The constitutional powers of the secular state and the constitutional power given to all the global and local priesthood leaders and all the other members of the church can make this happen. The secular law enforcement authorities of the United States of America are already showing the way by doing their duty to bring the arrogant, lying, and stealing criminals who are the church's first presidency and presiding bishopric to justice. We will explore in forensic detail how the Latter-day Saints' system of accountability and discipline works when applied to the first presidency, so there can be no doubt in your minds. My intention is to give you the confidence to move forward with faith and justice to use your constitutional rights in both secular and LDS settings to fix the mess we are all in and hopefully end once and for all this brutal Mormon civil war. Or at least buy us another period of peace and recovery before we all screw it up again. War and peace. But first, we need to tackle a couple more of the mental blocks that stop Latter day Saints from using these systems to save their church. As I described earlier, one of the thought stopping assumptions I encounter a lot when trying to reason with local LDS leaders that they could play a crucial role in making reforms happen in the church is their belief that no institution is perfect and it is enough to wait for slow, incremental changes to happen over many years in the LDS Church, as they have seen happen in the past. No need to upset the apple cart or disturb the peace. No need to risk losing your temple recommend and your calling by being seen to directly challenge the status quo and the leaders. No urgency. We can't do better than we are now. The problems really aren't as bad as you hysterical anti-Mormon podcasters keep saying it is. All churches are having the same problem now, so let's trundle along, matching their levels of failure, and find comfort in not being alone as we all fail together. So, to break them out of their mind-forged manacles, the obvious thing to do is to force them to get real about the data and the statistical trends, the stark reality that they can see happening all around them, that most of their family members and most of their congregations have already left and the rest will leave in the next few years. That's not too hard to do now, it is becoming so obvious. But even when they can see that time is running out and the urgency is extreme, they still don't then leap into action to do radical rebellious things to make radical reforms happen. Why? It seems obvious to me that this is the only way anything can be rescued from the ashes of this religion as it burns down. There is literally nothing left to lose anymore. The doom, if reforms don't happen, is now guaranteed, and desperate times surely call for desperate measures. It's what I and a tiny handful of others, like the September 6 we've been commemorating this September, and a few other Latter day Saints did when we realized what is going on and how little time we have left. So why on earth don't they? Why has there not been a mass uprising of the members facing this imminent end of their congregations to demand changes now? Well, the second follow-up defensive wall that we have to break through after convincing them that the membership really is collapsing and we are losing the next generation of Latter-day Saints is the idea that there is nothing they can do about this state of affairs. Resistance to the morgue is futile. Certainly nothing if the only way forward is to remove President Nelson and Dallin Oaks and Henry B. Eyring and all the other apostles who think like them from their callings and replace them if they cannot be persuaded to change their ways. How would you even do that? Why would God allow this to happen and the wrong people to be in power if so much of it is wrong? It must somehow all be part of God's plan, or the first presidency would have made the necessary changes already. It's not our place and not our responsibility to do anything about this. So they are stuck, helpless, zombified, keeping their heads down to help the people they still can, and hoping to buck the trend and at least keep some of their own children active, while the church falls apart outside their bubble of safety that isn't so safe. I want to tackle that mistaken assumption of helplessness head on and convince you that it is your place, your responsibility, your duty as a Latter day Saint to step up and take action to replace the leadership and insist on better priorities than theirs for the church. I know this seems impossible and totally incompatible with what you've been taught about your place in the church all your life in it. But what you were taught is wrong. How exciting! Are you intrigued? Can you feel some glowing embers of rebellion firing up in your belly or burning in your bosoms? I've got middle-aged spread man boobs now from all the chocolates and school dinner cake and custard I've been guzzling, and these bosoms are on fire. It is always a difficult challenge for human beings with all their messiness and competing motivations, needs, and opinions to come together and try to create a utopia, a Zion, a perfect society. Idealists trying to reform the world and construct such societies usually fail, and often with horrific results, because they're utopias that never factored into their plans unavoidable realities, and the dark sides of human nature can quickly turn into living hells. Communists, with what seems in theory to be a great way to fix poverty and depression, have kept trying for a century to impose their vision on people, who they always, almost immediately, end up enslaving, slaughtering, and starving on a far larger scale than the regimes they revolted against. All high demand fundamentalist religions who convince their members to make huge sacrifices and life changes to build their versions of heaven on earth end up creating tyrannies, trying to force people to be as good as they want them to be in exactly the way their leaders think good is meant to look. They all fail because their success criteria don't actually match human nature and capabilities, or there are fundamental errors in what the leaders of those religions believe a perfect society should prioritize. Most significantly of all dangerous utopians foolishly assume that an ideal society has to have everyone thinking and behaving in exactly the same way. Preferably exactly the same way as the dear leader thinks and behaves. They can't imagine that you can have unity by tolerating and even encouraging diversity, or that the only way to maintain any kind of social unity long term is to have tolerance and encouragement of diversity. Even the usually cantankerous, rather sexist, and fanatical Apostle Paul understood this, with his beautiful metaphor of the church being like a human body with wildly different component parts that are nonetheless all just as important as each other and unified by charitable love. Not dressing the same and using exactly the same grammar when they pray, which appear to be the prime directives of today's LDS apostles, claiming to hold Paul's position and authority in God's kingdom now. However, in all these different failed political and religious utopias, and the huge costs they have inflicted on billions of people for generations, there has been one overwhelming and inspiring success story. A solution that enables a genuine utopia to be created, while resilient enough to deal with all the intractable weaknesses and failings of human leaders and human followers. The human desire for freedom and peace and progress has learnt from all these mistakes, and, also with a long struggle and a lot of bloodshed, arrived at an organized system of government that works for a religion just as effectively as it works for political government. It is called, drumroll, democracy. Democracy, where all the adult citizens regularly vote to choose their leaders and representatives and the policies they want them to enact, and to remove them and replace them if they don't do a proper job or enact the will of the voters. Democracy with the essential components of laws protecting freedom to think and speak and learn. Democracy with robust separation of powers so that all power is not concentrated in one person or one institution of government. Instead, power is evenly divided between several institutions that can scrutinize and police and if necessary, discipline or replace the officials in the other institutions when they become dangerous to the whole community. In most of the modern democracies, the power is separated between what is called the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The executive is the head of state. In the USA, the president and his White House team. In the UK, it is the constitutional monarch, currently King Charles III. The legislature is the elected lawmaking parliament. In the USA, this has further checks and balances on power by comprising two separate institutions, the Senate and Congress. Here in the UK, we have the unelected House of Lords and the elected House of Commons. The third institution, the judiciary, is staffed by senior judges who are guardians and upholders of the law and respond with new legal precedents when laws need updating or clarifying. In the UK, the monarch and Houses of Parliament must respect and function within the restraints of the law, and if they don't, a judicial inquiry occurs and decides whether they have overstepped their authority. The king has the power to dissolve Parliament and trigger a new general election if the members of the House of Commons are unable to form a government with the support of a majority of the members of Parliament. A very helpful safety net in the event of a hung Parliament. And if the king goes too far, Parliament will chop his head off or replace him as head of state, like the other times that happened. But this is not enough. The essential fourth component of a free democracy is a free press that can investigate the decisions and lives and secret deals of the royal families, the presidents, the parliamentarians, and the judges, and use public exposure and shame to keep them in line or force them to resign if they break the rules, and engage in what Doctrine and Covenants delightfully calls unrighteous dominion. Truth and transparency cannot happen without the ruthless and persistent accountability administered by a free press. When these institutions become unbalanced or try to diminish each other, all hell breaks loose. The first thing dictators do is shut down newspapers and TV stations that challenge or disagree with them. American politics and its legislative agenda has been wrecked in recent years by the massive distraction and distortion of giving too much power to its presidents to appoint the Supreme Court judges and then give them effective control of legislation and override democracy in profoundly important matters like access to contraception and abortion that would be decided by the elected legislature in other democracies. The USA's state legislatures are adjusting to this reality and stepping up now to legislate the protections and rights that the Supreme Court has just recently abandoned, so hopefully the balance can be restored again. And that's the point. With the separation of powers, there are backup plans and options for addressing these issues. Israel tore itself apart this year when its very right-wing government tried to introduce similar politicized control over its judiciary, and multitudes of concerned citizens took to the streets to protest against this threat to their freedoms and civil rights. And while they were thus distracted by internal divisions, Hamas took the opportunity to invade and slaughter and kidnap hundreds of their civilians and trigger the biggest crisis in the Middle East since the Iraq War. Who knew that arcane matters of the degrees of separation of powers in a constitutional democracy could end up having such astonishing consequences? Keeping this delicate balance of separated powers fair and functional is crucial to the health and survival of free societies. Because it can get so fraught and contentious, democracy is too often seen as weak by the citizens exhausted by it, and by totalitarian despots who can just terrify and bully and buy their way to fast decision making and big projects in their countries that look impressive and efficient from afar, but usually backfire or fail because they have ignored the process of sensible consultation, preparation, planning, and improvement that democratic discussion and scrutiny apply before a new law or decision is made. The landscape of dictatorships is littered with massive civil engineering projects and ghost towns of empty housing and government buildings in the wrong places that were the envy of their frustrated democratic neighbors when they were constructed astonishingly quickly without the constraints of planning laws and public consultations, or because the dear leader thought they would be a great idea and no one felt safe enough to tell him he was wrong. Democracy may look divisive and weak, and democracies constantly fret about being divided societies, but they are actually far healthier and more resilient through times of crisis than the rigid dictatorships that fracture and collapse under the weight of their own oversimplification of power and evil. All of these social and political realities apply just as much in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as they do in secular government and politics. And not just in the sense that we bring our secular lives to church with us, but because they are meant to apply in the same way. One of the biggest lies I was repeatedly taught by my leaders, teachers, and general authorities in our lifetime as a Latter-day Saint, which means you all got taught this lie too, was that democracy has no place in our church or in God's kingdom. We are a theocracy, we kept being taught, a benevolent dictatorship of a tiny handful of just men who are directed perfectly by God. Coincidentally, this was taught by First Presidency Councillor N. Eldon Tanner in the first General Conference after my baptism as an 8-year-old in October 1979. I can't claim to remember it clearly, but listening to it again, it is interesting to note that, as I have discovered so often analysing conference talks decades later, like a moth to a flame, something in N. Eldon's brain made him do what Dallin Oakes did in the March 2020 Ensign. He referenced section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants as the proof that the church should be led as a dictatorship of the infallible president of the church and the other apostles, speaking perfectly for God, when in fact it very thoroughly teaches the opposite, that several other quorums, including stake high councils, are equal in authority to them, and that any bishop can judge and discipline even the president of the church when they are inevitably not infallible. N. Eldon Tanner's talk, The Administration of the Church, and Dallin Oakes' article, The Lord Leads His Church Through Prophets and Apostles, that I've dissected in previous episodes, both intentionally ignore all those bits to gaslight the church membership that there is nothing in those scriptures to challenge their absolute power, and thus these loyal First Presidency councillors tried to neutralize what is the biggest threat to their illegitimate regimes and how they do business. Their tactics have not changed in 40 years.
I'd like to tell you something about the way the church operates from headquarters. We often hear the church referred to as a democracy, when in reality, instead of being a church where the body is governed by officers elected by the members, the church is a theocracy, where God directs his church through the representative chosen by him. Our fifth article of faith states, we believe that man must be called of God by prophecy, by the laying on of hands, by those who are in authority to preach the gospel and administer in the ordinances thereof. Now, this is the way Joseph Smith was chosen by the Lord as president of his church and set apart by those authorized by the Lord to do so. It's always been a testimony to me as I read the 107th section of the Doctrine and Covenants to see how all the offices of the priesthood were listed, the duties of each given to Joseph Smith.
In the last paragraphs of his March 2020 article, Dallin Oakes threw in a contradictory acknowledgement that the law of common consent also applies, as well as the unquestionable dictatorship of the apostles, and told a massive lie that we have been following that principle since 1830 before authorizing anything as doctrinal. The last time that happened was in 1978, when the membership were invited to vote to authorize giving black people back their priesthood and temple ordinances. But he taught that not doing this is one of the signs of apostasy. The many contradictory parts of Dallin Oakes' brain just baffle me. He seems to do self-contradictory mental gymnastics more often and on a more diverse set of topics than any other LDS apostle, whether it is about racism or accountability, as I've been documenting in this podcast. What you are about to hear about common consent voting was published in the Ensign by the same man who has unilaterally declared in General Conference that the family proclamation meets all the criteria for official doctrine because only the apostles have voted to ratify it. The principle he was teaching in the first 80% of this article. Quote, all of this shows the Lord's direction that his church must be governed by councils of apostles and prophets. This protects and promotes the unity that is essential in the Lord's church. Quote, the Lord, in the beginning of this work, revealed that there should be 3 high priests to preside over the high priesthood of his church and over the whole church, close quote, President Joseph F. Smith taught in the General Conference where he was sustained as president of the church. He affirms the importance of 3 high priests in the presidency by declaring, quote, that it is wrong for one man to exercise all the authority and power of presidency in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, close quote. He added, quote, the Lord never did intend that one man should have all power, and for that reason he has placed in his church presidents, apostles, high priests, 70s, etc. Close quote. The reference to the plural prophets and apostles is also prominent in this familiar teaching by President Joseph Fielding Smith. Open quote. There is one thing which we should have exceedingly clear in our minds. Neither the President of the Church, nor the First Presidency, nor the united voice of the First Presidency and the 12 will ever lead the saints astray, or send forth counsel to the world that is contrary to the mind and will of the Lord. Close quote. To become the official doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ, the individual teachings of apostles and even prophets need to be affirmed through the process of approval by other apostles and prophets. This is illustrated in the Bible in the approving action of the apostles when Peter reported his revelation to take the gospel to the Gentiles. See Acts 11, verse 1 and 18. Similarly, when the dispute over the need for circumcision was brought to the apostles, Peter reminded them of the significance of the revelation he had received, and the council then approved and settled the dispute with a confirming epistle to the church. See Acts 15. So far, Dallin's just reinforcing the idea that the apostles determine what is doctrine and authoritative all by themselves. Now he suddenly flips tack. Similarly, in the restored church, doctrine is not canonized until the body of the church has received it by the law of common consent. See Doctrine and Covenants 26.2 and 28.13. That principle was revealed in 1830 and has been applied since that time. This practice, which had not been followed by churches existing during the period we call the apostasy, protects gospel truths from being altered or influenced by private ideas or individual opinions. Close quote. In his talk in 1979, N. Eldon Tanner also mentioned common consent voting and what happens when someone exercises their right to vote opposed. I'd love to play you the video of this, as I did the earlier quotes from this talk, but curiously, about 11 minutes in, several minutes of the talk, including the reference to voting opposed in General Conference smack in the middle of them, have been edited out of the film and audio versions you can watch and download on the General Conference and Ensign magazine archives in the church website. So much for the late M. Russell Ballard's assertion that the church leaders never hide anything from anybody.
But it's this idea that the church is hiding something, which we would have to say as two apostles who have covered the world and know the history of the church and know the integrity of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 from the beginning of time. There has been no attempt on the part in any way of the church leaders trying to hide anything from anybody. So just trust us wherever you are in the world, and you share this message with anyone else who raises the question about the church not being transparent. We're as transparent as we know how to be in telling the truth. We have to do that. That's the Lord's way.
But the words are still there in the written account of the talk in the November 1979 Ensign magazine. I double-checked in the official conference report the church published as well, and it is all there for us to read. But for some reason, someone in the sprawling bureaucracy of lies and lying decided it should never be seen or heard again as a video. This begs so many questions. Are they hoping the kids of today who can't be bothered to read stuff and want their information in easily digestible video format will therefore never be told this vital aspect of their rights to have the first presidency investigate their opposing vote in a general conference? A job they now delegate to stake presidents? Who would have been so worried about what this first presidency member said that they would go to the trouble of carefully excising it and its context so that the film can flow seamlessly without it? Who knows? Maybe we will find out one day. Anyway, here are the forbidden words from N. Eldon Tanner's talk explaining the administration of the church, which he gave with a bit more fluff in it a year earlier at BYU. You can find what appears to be the entire video of that in YouTube. Or maybe bits of that got edited out too. In this age of the apostles and correlated teaching manuals, repeatedly telling us to only trust the, quote, divinely appointed sources of information the church produces, and even actually now provides for the first time ever at least 2 lists of what those divinely appointed sources even are in the seminaries and institute resources. It is amazing how often I find, while digging around for the original video or transcript of something said by a general authority in a public address, that the crucial quotes supporting Christian Mormonism in its battle against Pharisee Mormonism have been edited out by the church and thrown down the memory hole. As critics of the church often reference as some examples of this, Boyd K. Packer's exasperated statement in conference that God would never allow someone to be born LGBTQ was carefully reworded in the written version of his talk that appeared in the Ensign. And poor Elder Perlman of the 70, who in October actual 1984 gave the most powerful talk ever about the gospel being more important and bigger than the institutional LDS Church, which should be launching us into independent revelatory spirituality, not making itself the be-all and end-all of our spiritual lives. He was marched straight back to the tabernacle pulpit to refilm a completely different version of his talk with a cough track teaching the exact opposite, that was then released and published as if it had been his original General Conference talk, in one of the most brazen acts of deception of many the Church has engaged in, lying to its members and making them question their sanity because they remembered what he had actually said. In my own research for the podcast, I have discovered parts of First Presidency member Hugh B. Brown's amazing and brave speeches at BYU in the 20th century, pleading for a rational faith where all opinions can be expressed without fear of punishment, that are present in the written transcripts of his talk, but missing from the audio on the BYU Speeches website, as I've discussed before. And here we go again with this General Conference talk by First Presidency Councillor N. Eldon Tanner. His terribly dangerous, forbidden words in October 1979 General Conference to newly baptized 8-year-old me were, quote, "At this point, I might answer the question of how we deal with the dissenting vote. We had one in October 1977 conference. Some of you heard the proceedings and will remember that the dissenter wanted his vote recorded. This is the way we deal with the dissenting vote. All the people, other than this one, voted to sustain those who were presented, so I asked him to see a member of the 12. The purpose of asking him to see somebody is so that he can report why he was not prepared to support the slate of officers. That gives him an opportunity, if he knows some good reason why a person should not be or is not qualified to be sustained, to tell the person assigned to see him. This person can then advise the First Presidency." Close quote. I love that. N. Eldon reiterated that the purpose of the opposing vote is a safeguarding one, to make sure the person being appointed is not unworthy or unfit to serve. That used to be universally understood in the Church, but in recent years people seem to have forgotten it, as the weasel words of leaders like Henry B. Eyring and Emeritus 70 President F. Whitney Clayton, in their talks, "The Power of Sustaining Faith" and "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it," convinced them that only God can hold leaders accountable. Our place is to unquestioningly and unconditionally sustain and obey them, regardless of what they say and do, because it is a sin we must repent of to even think of leaders as having human weaknesses, and thus the possibility that they might sometimes be wrong, and we should do something about it when they are wrong. So now it is normal for church members in social media chat threads about first presidencies and some apostles like Geoffrey Holland and recently ordained Brit Patrick Kieran being appointed and ordained in secret long before any voting by the membership, to line up and declare there is nothing wrong with this because they can be voted about months after it is too late to stop them, even though that would never happen for the ordination of a bishop or stake president. None of that would have made any sense to church members when I was growing up. And so it is that we let them do all the thinking and deciding without expecting to be consulted or even express an opinion, because they know what is best for us all far better than we can ever possibly know it for ourselves. Even when their ideas and decisions seem crazy and contradictory and even evil, our role is to unconditionally trust and obey them, with the promise that everything will work out in the long run, in the next life, if not in this. In the next life, if not in this. Think about that for a moment. This is the get out of responsibility and accountability free clause in all dictatorial religious systems. Even if being in this religion and doing what its leaders tell you to totally ruins your life, even if it makes you harm other people, ignore and then make excuses for the harm being done to other people, even if it ruins your relationships in unnecessary ways with your spouse, your parents, your siblings, your children, or your work colleagues, even if it impoverishes you, even if it causes you to not get the physical and mental health care you need. Even if following these leaders with exactness takes away from you opportunities for growth and development and education and better employment, especially as a woman, the big bamboozle that can never be fact checked is that this is God's plan for your life, and you will be rewarded for your compliance and trust after you are dead. You can use that justification for keeping people trapped in any system of oppression, because no one can actually visit the afterlife and come back and confirm if it is true. Several people have claimed to have visited or seen the afterlife, including in Mormonism, but we are now finding to our horror that the Latter-day Saints making those claims of visionary after-death and near-death experiences keep ending up actually murdering their children and spouses. The last few months in Mormonism have literally been a horror show of murder and abuse that you couldn't have imagined would be possible, but it has hard lessons for us all to learn from. Just when you think things in our collapsing religion couldn't get more crazy and improbable, they have sunk to yet another new low. Hardworking journalists and the Mormonism watching podcasts like Mormon Stories, Mormon Discussions, and the awesome Mormon News Roundup with Dives Lazarus that I had the pleasure to co host in the middle of all this a few weeks ago have been doing a sterling job of being the free press, the fourth estate. That is the only healthy and effective component left in how power in the wider LDS world is functioning right now. The executive is senile. The common consent and separation of powers legislature has been entirely shut down, and the judiciary keeps excommunicating people for telling the truth. The LDS Church owns actual news TV channels and newspapers like Deseret News and Church News and the Church Newsroom that it runs as propaganda operations. They are definitely not a free press. But these independent operations are increasingly stepping up to fulfill the role and lead the way for the too often timid Salt Lake Tribune that has historically been the only source of objective news about what is going on in the church. We have been commemorating the 30th anniversary of the 1993 September 6 excommunications of LDS intellectuals and scholars, orchestrated in violation of the church's own rules that discipline should only be initiated by local leaders by Apostle Boyd K. Packer. A very unexpected twist in the story we really didn't see coming is that one of their number, Avraham Gileadi, who was quickly reinstated to membership and influence in the church and BYU, was an actually dangerous guy. His area of focus and publishing as a BYU professor has been the Book of Isaiah, and he has developed an interpretation that it is not just prophesying of Jesus as the Messiah, but also a Davidic servant who will be some kind of Messiah king in the last days and is yet to come. This taps straight into the Mormon polygamous fundamentalists' obsession with the claimed prophecy about one mighty and strong who will have a similar role in the last days. The religiously fanatic rapist Brian Mitchell, who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart for 9 months, believed he was the Davidic servant in Gileadi's books. Despite these alarming consequences of his ideas, Avraham is still pushing them hard and leading conferences about them, as we see in this recent appearance on the LDS Imminent End Times Prepping the Latter-day Disciples podcast, hosted by Megan Farner, who is clearly enthralled by him and his ideas. The episode is titled The Davidic Servant with Avraham Gileadi, and was recorded 4 months ago on the 23rd of August 2023. In it, Gileadi describes how he was taught and mentored by evangelical Christian Old Testament scholar Roland K. Harrison at the University of Toronto, who he describes as a leading, quote, conservative scholar, close quote, as something to be proud of. I'm suspicious of any academic teacher claiming to be the greatest respectable authority in their field of research, which should surely require a strictly objective approach to all evidence and opinions about it at all times, who declares a biased allegiance to a socio-political worldview. But at the polls of America's binary culture war, this apparently has become par for the course, to be taken seriously by the faction in that polarization you are trying to appeal to. References are made bigging up Avraham's own credibility because Hugh Nibley was impressed with him. Yes, Hugh Nibley, who's been dead for decades. And they both boldly promote the basic ideology of the fundamentalist end times prepper movement that the mainstream world, including most members of the church, and by clear implication, the LDS prophet, are missing the main message of the Book of Mormon and its emphasis on Isaiah. That the Davidic servants will be like a new Christ and lead the reunification of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel in practical ways, which means war and politics, not just spiritual metaphors about converting people. He says that the church has jumped the gun and got it wrong, teaching that the reunification of the sticks of Judah and Israel has already happened with the Bible and Book of Mormon coming together in LDS scriptures. That only their tiny community within a tiny Mormon world have actually understood and received a full and true revelation of what God is doing in all these matters. They are in full persecution complex mode for the criticisms they get for their positions. And he says that somehow the Lamanites are involved. And even specifically, Avraham prophesies that stuff is really going to kick off next year in 2024 because of a solar eclipse. There were 2 solar and 2 lunar eclipses this year in 2023. Why didn't they count? Even by standard LDS norms, these people have really gone to apostate and disloyal La La Land and are talking nonsense. Yet he is still apparently lecturing at BYU, while faculty there are being fired if their bishop interpreted things they said as having empathy for LGBTQ people. This is how in thrall to prepper fundamentalists the mainstream members and leaders of the church are, and how inept they are at seeing them for the danger that they are. This podcast alone should have got Avraham excommunicated again for apostasy, with its clear message that he is a better prophet of the immediate future and much more truthful exponent of what the scriptures mean than the 15 prophets, seers, and revelators of the LDS Church are. A clear challenge to their credibility and authority. But nothing appears to have been done. We will all see how long that lasts, as all the pieces of the puzzle that he is a major component of continue to come together in the murder, kidnapping, torture, financial fraud, and sexual abuse trials over the coming months. To her credit, like a lot of the other podcasters and thought leaders who have been buying into and promoting the inspiration, credibility, and worldview of the people and the books I'm about to try and navigate and make sense of for you, Megan Farner has hosted a panel discussion of like-minded people a month ago on her podcast titled Principles of Discernment, Tim Ballard, Visions of Glory and Seeking Truth, in which they discussed being much more careful about balancing faith in God and trust in untrustworthy people, and ways to discern the difference. Hopefully, everything kicking off now will inspire a sobering course correction for a lot of Latter-day Saints like her, who are trained by the church to be far too trusting and naive and easy to manipulate by people copying the general authorities' tactics.
Hey guys, we are the Latter-day Disciples. Our team is dedicated to helping you boldly live the gospel, recognize the signs of the times, and prepare for the return of our Savior, Jesus Christ. But I wanted to bring him back this week in part because of the incredible conference that the Isaiah Institute is hosting this coming Saturday, August 26th. He will be speaking about the topic of the Davidic servant. There are several quotes, testimonials on your website that I personally have found really impactful. I noted that Professor David Noel Friedman of the University of Michigan, previously who was the most liberal scholar of the Old Testament at the time, said Dr. Gileadi has achieved a major breakthrough in the investigation of a book of such complexity and importance as the book of Isaiah. And then opposite of that, Professor Roland K. Harrison of Wycliffe College, who was the most conservative scholar of the Old Testament at the time, said Dr. Gileadi's work will render obsolete almost all the speculations of Isaiah scholars over the last 100 years, enabling scholarship to proceed along an entirely new line, opening new avenues of approach for others to follow. Most certainly, you have established yourself as the most accredited and knowledgeable scholar on the book of Isaiah, certainly that I know of. But of all the testimonials on your website, the one that had me completely sold was from Professor Hugh Nibley of Brigham Young University, who said, Dr. Gileadi is the only LDS scholar I know of who is thoroughly competent to teach the words of Isaiah. I read that testimonial for the first time over a year ago, and I knew immediately that you were legitimate and a voice that I needed to hear.
Yes, he was my PhD chairman. So, and also a personal friend. I visited him a lot in his home right up to the last, and he repeated that thing that he said during my PhD program. And he repeated it later on before he died. And he shared with me some amazing experiences of his, actually, and which led me to believe that that he has an amazingly wonderful place where he is now. So, yes, always a good friend.
I think
and a mentor, of course, because I attended every class of his. Typically, his classes were like full at the beginning of the semester during my programs there at BYU. And near the end of the semester, there were just a few stragglers of us. The rest of them had fled because they didn't know what he was talking about. For the most part, right over their heads. When I went to study in Toronto with Roland K. Harrison, the most conservative and most famous conservative scholar, he took me under his wing. Thank God that he did. It was an amazing eye-opener for me to get away from some of the LDS narrow point of view to a broad, much broader point of view. He taught me not to be afraid of liberal scholars and their views, extreme views, because things that were supposedly said in concrete were not, and they could just be proven not to be always, sound, like the two Isaiah theories, for example, that there was more than one prophet Isaiah. And I've just proven that in my literary discoveries. It opens up this whole theology and prophecy of the book of Isaiah that no one ever guessed was there. And it's laying dormant and hidden for all these centuries since the time of Isaiah. And I'm sure that the sealed books that are going to come forward, that Nephi talks about, a number of them, will have a lot of what Isaiah is talking about. So it's really important for us to be grounded in Isaiah before they come out, so we'll know what they're, we'll not throw them out the window. And so it takes you right through the millennial time, and it clues you in to what our role is as Latter-day Saints today, as Ephraimites, but also as Gentiles. And that's another whole topic that we can address in a moment if you want that. It's so exciting, and it's necessary that we get to that understanding. Otherwise, we have no clue of what our role really is going to be in that time, the time that's almost upon us now. Yeah.
The Lord says that the last days are a time of confusion, that there are false prophets and false Christs, and there are all manner of institutions that are brought up in wickedness, and that these all have a compelling element to them, that even the very elect, if it were possible, would be deceived. And it seems to me, and I'm sure you would agree, that understanding the book of Isaiah, such as you were talking about, prepares us to be able to appropriately discern the things that are true and godly and the things that are not. Would you say that's accurate?
And it shows us the patterns in which God works, because he works according to ancient patterns. And we can also tell the counterfeits when they come along, because they do not follow the pattern. You know, the 144,000, what their mission on the earth is. It's all in Isaiah. And not to know that will leave us in complete ignorance if we think we understand the Book of Mormon. And she literally said, woe to the person who understands the Book of Mormon, because he knew that such a person would be ostracized, they'd be vilified, they'd be persecuted, because if they understood it right, everybody else would be objecting to what they understood. And that's kind of what it is to us in the Isaiah Institute. We deal with some of that from the people who have not searched the words of Isaiah.
Your particular topic is about the Davidic servant. And this is a topic, first off, I feel like it's not very well known, this doctrine, this truth. And if it is heard, it's incredibly controversial, and it's consistently discredited by those who are not as familiar with the work of Isaiah and the comprehensive truth where this person is really declared throughout all of the standard works. Can you tell us a little bit about your topic and of the Davidic servant, who this person is, and why it is a controversial thing to talk about them?
Most people think, and scripture, chapter headings in the scriptures say it's Jesus Christ, and it isn't. The chapter headings are not scripture. They're somebody's idea that they put there. And interpretations, anyway, have no place as chapter headings. They should be summaries of what the chapter says. Besides that, yes, people get upset because they have not searched the scriptures themselves. And therefore, when they haven't heard something 100 times or 1,000 times before, they don't believe it. They think, I've not heard that before, that can't be true. Well, the fact is, it is true. And if you truly understood Isaiah, you'd know that it was true. And not just Isaiah, but Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others also talk about this latter-day David. And so does the prophet Joseph Smith. He says that the Lord will raise up one out of David's lineage by the name of David in the last days, who would do basically the things that ancient David did. And one of the things he does is gather Israel and unite Israel. The two houses of Israel, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, have been divided ever since Solomon's time, when they divided that at that time. And we misinterpreted Ezekiel's allegory about that, the reunion of the two houses of Israel, two sticks. We've put the cart before the cart before the horse in that interpretation. And yeah, we have not tied in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah together to show that all of this is an end time scenario in which Jesus is not on the earth. He's coming in glory. He's the Savior. He's the Messiah, the only Messiah, but he's not that servant. And there's a whole scenario that happens, an end time scenario, that's a preparation for the coming of Jesus. And it's a prelude to the coming of Jesus. And if those people who find objections with that, it's because then they're the ones who are most under condemnation, because they refuse to search it out. As Nephi says, they will not search knowledge. They will not search great knowledge when it's given unto them. And as plain as word can be, even then they don't believe it. And that's where the divide is. And that divide is going to continue to roll on, because it's not going away. Those people, we know from Isaiah and other scriptures, they're not going to understand Isaiah enough to take part in the end time scenario. And the ones who do, I heard a query from a person the other day who said, I've been raised in the church, but I always felt something was missing. And then he got into my books on Isaiah, or into the words of Isaiah, And the pieces started coming together. And then he started saying, well, why haven't I known this before? Why haven't I seen this before? But that's how the Savior does it. He commands us to search, and we will not know what it is until we ourselves do the searching. The prophet cannot tell us what Isaiah is saying, because Jesus commands it and makes an individual command for all of us to search the words of Isaiah. And when we do, we finally get it. And when we don't, we're left in ignorance. And we object to something we haven't heard before. It's as simple as that. It boils down to, not searching the words of Isaiah, not searching the scriptures, not putting the whole scenario together, not seeing that Jesus, when he quotes Isaiah, when Nephi quotes Isaiah, it's an end time scenario. And it's not Jesus leading everything. It's his servants who are doing the leading, being engaged in those things that we ought to be engaged in. Otherwise, we'll never know our role. And when our role needs to be fulfilled, that of Ephraim as the birthright tribe, then it'll pass us by. And if we're not saviors of the house of Israel, the Jews, the 10 tribes, and the Lamanites of today will be as salt that is lost its savor. It's as simple as that.
And I think that it's an interesting aspect of potentially a veil of unbelief that is largely over us as members of the church, that we don't seem to believe that the Lord will raise up a prophet, the likes of Moses, the likes of Joseph Smith, a John the Baptist who prepares the way for the Savior. And yet the scriptures are replete with this pattern of a deliverer who comes, who offers physical salvation, who reveals records and translates them by the power of God. And I think, as you said, if we had an understanding of the scriptures, and if we looked at them with an eye of faith, it would seem logical that the Lord will raise up someone in a similar fashion to do that work in the last days. There is an important caveat, though, in that we know that the Lord has told us that we need to beware of false prophets. How does that relate to the coming Davidic servant?
Right, Megan? It's a good question, too. You're asking really great questions. Well, this, not just in the Old Testament, I was going to mention, like Black Elk speaks. Black Elk was a visionary. There were Native American visionaries who saw the coming of this person. In his case, it was likened to a black horse. And there were 6 grandfathers, and which I interpret to be dispensation leaders, and 4 sets of 12 horses from the north, south, east, and west. And the black horse came at the end. I think he was the 7th grandfather, and gathered all the elect, basically, as Jesus says in Matthew 24, from around the world, and led them to the happy hunting ground with the millennial age. But yeah, to your question about the false Christ, I don't think very many people are coming along who claiming to be Jesus Christ. But we've already seen quite a few false claimants of being a Latter-day David. And basically, it's more par for the course because it tells us we're there. Those are the people that are going to be the false Christ and false prophets. They're trying to be this messianic figure, which the servant is, though he's not himself the Messiah. He is a messianic person, as Joseph Smith was a messianic person. And they're going to be counterfeits that come along. And because of that, we get a bad rap about the servant himself, which is not. You can't pin that onto the idea that the idea of the servant is in Isaiah. It's in the scriptures. It's the words of Jesus Christ. He himself talks about the servant in 3 Nephi 21. And again, people misinterpret that saying it's Joseph Smith. No, it's not. It's not. It's an end time scenario. Aren't you reading the text? What he's quoting? No, they just want to get it wrong each time. If they haven't done the searching, they will get it wrong. And they will run with what they know, what they perceive, because they haven't searched themselves. And they will end up in a bad place. But yeah, so the false Christs are coming, likely imposters of the Latter-day David. And we've already seen enough of them to know that, hey, this is beginning to be almost like a phenomenon today. Yeah.
And
it's kind of funny when you think about it, because these people
it's somewhat
have
ironic.
No clue what they're talking about. Yeah.
It's a challenging role, and if someone wants to take that on, I don't
Oh,
know if they really understand the bad that's going to come with that as well as the good. But I can attest to that. I've had run-ins with people who believe that they are this David as well, and it definitely requires an eye and a heart for discernment.
I chose that topic because I think it is very imminent, that his appearance is going to be imminent, especially as we move into 2024 next year with the solar eclipse that's happening. And as I see the world changing right now into this country, especially into such decadence, it's almost indescribable that we can imagine what's happening now, unless you're, walking with your eyes closed and not seeing what's going on in the world, or unless you're watching, certain TV programs that make you try to believe what they want you to believe. And yeah, unless you're deceived, basically. That's what Jesus said, watch out for that deception. Because there's a huge agenda to deceive right now in the world, and very few are actually seeing what's true. By the time he comes, I believe there will already be this division that I've been talking about from those who are versed with the scriptures and those who are not. And a lot of people will go one way, and very few will get it right, I believe, according to the prophecies and the Book of Mormon especially.
In my opinion, Avraham Gileadi is a loon bat, high on his own ego, loving his role as the informal prophet of a community of Latter-day Saints hungry for more drama and significance in their ordinary lives, who believe his pronouncements that they are part of an elite community with a vital role to play in preparing the world for the return of Christ, because they believe his very much not mainstream theories about Isaiah and the Davidic servant. Having a PhD in one narrow area of research doesn't make you right about that area of research or anything else at all. It doesn't mean you have common sense. It does not automatically mean you are still taking the same care about what you publish as the writings of a trustworthy expert decades later as you did when you were turning in papers at college for your qualification. Like all leaders of high-demand fundamentalist religions, especially the small ones, we have witnessed just in this one conversation Avraham Gileadi flatter his fans' egos by telling them that because they believe he is telling them the most important truth of the ages, they have superior scriptural and spiritual discernment to everyone else. And they flatter his ego by hanging on his every word. And in that bubble of confirmation bias, he has increasingly detached from mainstream scholarship and mainstream life, and he has got sloppy. He drops balls of credibility all over the place. He trusts himself far too much. For a start, he is playing his mentor Hugh Nibley's fundamentally flawed game of parallelisms, randomly quoting a Native American mystic's vague prophecy as a revelation from God because it can sort of be matched to an extremely shallow reading of the biblical dispensations of time as interpreted by Joseph Smith.
Like Black Elk speaks. Black Elk was a visionary. There were Native American visionaries who saw the coming of this person. In his case, it was likened to a black horse. And there were 6 grandfathers, and which I interpret to be dispensation leaders, and 4 sets of 12 horses from the north, south, east, and west. And the black horse came at the end. I think he was the 7th grandfather, and gathered all the elect, basically, as Jesus says in Matthew 24, from around the world, and led them to the happy hunting ground of the millennial age.
He said hardly anyone claims to be Jesus Christ these days, when every corner of the Christian world and its mental health services is full of people who think they are the second coming of Jesus. And he said that more people are claiming to be the Davidic servant. The only people who are claiming that and using that idea to justify doing dangerous things like kidnapping and raping children are Mormons who have read his books. Yet he chuckles about these horrors as if they are not his responsibility, because he believes his own delusion that his Davidic servant idea is so obvious if you just study Isaiah hard enough, that these impostors must have arrived at the idea without him.
But yeah, so the false Christs are coming, likely impostors of the Latter-day David, and we've already seen enough of them to know that, hey, this is beginning to be almost like a phenomenon today. Yeah.
And
it's kind of funny when you think about it, because these people
it's somewhat
have
ironic.
No clue what they're talking about. Yeah.
That's how dangerous people like Gileadi are. They seem harmless. They may speak softly. They may have clergy callings or paid employments with the church. They may waffle in academic and insider religious jargon about insider religious ideas that make no sense to outsiders. But when you carefully pay attention to what they are actually saying, it quickly becomes very serious indeed when they have followers who believe it all fervently. Did you notice that twice, I think, he casually mentioned that people who don't discover and believe what he is saying about the Davidic servants and the end times won't be permitted by God to participate in them, to be around when they happen? In the context of Mormon doctrines, this is deadly serious. It means that they will be burned and killed by God at his return. They will be judged as unworthy to survive the tribulations and testing of the latter days and the judgment day of God's wrath. They are not worthy to live with the returned Jesus on earth during the 1,000-year millennium. They will be sent to Mormon hell, the purgatory we call spirit prison, to suffer for their sins until they have paid enough in pain for them all, and then be granted a place in the second resurrection at the end of the millennium, before the final judgment, and presumably allocated to non-celestial lesser kingdoms for eternity, without their genitals, according to President Nelson in the last General Conference. Did you miss him saying that? He just muttered it in passing, but he did say it. Just as thousands of ordinary Latter-day Saints teach and repeat such things every week at church on a Sunday, it has been so normalized.
And it's a prelude to the coming of Jesus. And if those people who find objections with that, it's because then they're the ones who are most under condemnation, because they refuse to search it out. As Nephi says, they will not search knowledge. They will not search great knowledge when it's given unto them. And as plain as word can be, even then they don't believe it. And that's where the divide is. And that divide is going to continue to roll on, because it's not going away. Those people, we know from Isaiah and other scriptures, they're not going to understand Isaiah enough to take part in the end time scenario. And the ones who do, I heard a query from a person the other day who said, I've been raised in the church, but I always felt something was missing. And then he got into my books on Isaiah, or into the words of Isaiah, and the pieces started coming together. And then he started saying, well, why haven't I known this before? Why haven't I seen this before? But that's how the Savior does it. He commands us to search, and we will not know what it is until we ourselves do the searching. The prophet cannot tell us what Isaiah is saying. Being engaged in those things we ought to be engaged in. Otherwise, we'll never know our role. And when our role needs to be fulfilled, that of Ephraim as the birthright tribe, then it'll pass us by. And if we're not saviors of the house of Israel, the Jews, the 10 tribes, and the Lamanites of today, we'll be assaulted as us as savior. It's as simple as that.
It only takes a couple of steps from normalizing, as the LDS Church and a lot of the rest of Christianity does, the divine genocide for unworthiness and incorrect beliefs by your angry God of most of the people around you in the end times, that happen to be right now, according to the LDS prophets, to believing that it is your job and your calling to be doing some of that killing and punishing of the wicked and the deceived. Just a couple of steps. We have already completely normalized the idea that the life of an unbeliever is very expendable. To expect to literally see in our lifetimes God's genocidal wrath poured out upon all nations, and most of the people you go to work and school with, and that they will completely deserve it because they didn't join our church, or they drink coffee, or they wear strapless dresses, or they have sex outside marriage, or have an addiction, or watch pornography, or wear 2 pairs of earrings and speak no Tudor English when they pray. I will be repeating this point, so get used to it, my intrepid listeners. The gap between the murderous psychos we are going to become more familiar with and everyone else you sit in a sacrament meeting with on a Sunday is very, very small in far too many cases. They are not a rare aberration. They are an inevitable and growing consequence of what the Church's general authorities have recklessly and irresponsibly taught them to believe and become and want to be. After listening carefully to that interview and some of his other presentations, it seems clear that Abraham has concluded the leadership of the Church are in apostasy, or at least out of the revelatory loop, because they haven't noticed what he thinks is an obvious message in Isaiah, and he is not declaring any of them to be the Davidic servant named David. So David Bednar apparently isn't the Messiah he seems to think he is. My vote is for the new British apostle, Patrick Kieran. His second middle name is David. Or me. My middle name is David too, from a line of Davidsons that goes back to the Middle Ages. YouTube's algorithms have quickly concluded that I must be obsessed with the Gospel of Gileadi and filled up my feed with a whole new world of YouTube channels featuring his lectures and seminars and appearances on other uber-conservative LDS channels, like Greg Matson's Quick Media. I know now that Abraham has a very professionally organized website called Isaiah Institute, with loads of top quality films and resources, and his own YouTube channel. It is called Book of Mormon Isaiah. The website has section titles describing his key talking points, but if you click on them, they really don't explain what they claim to. His very specific interpretations of vague symbolism gets very out of hand very quickly. For example, one says Isaiah reveals 7 ascending and descending spiritual levels, but nothing in what he presents there says anything about there being specifically 7 levels or what they are. Just the usual sun, moon, and stars 3 degrees of glory. Another is titled An Ancient Superpower Typifies Today's Superpower America, and explains that all the references to Egypt in Isaiah's prophecies about the last days should be taken to refer to the USA as the superpower of the last days, and he warns that it is destined to collapse fast because of its wickedness, an idea echoed a lot by other doomsday prepper Mormon thought leaders, as they can't believe there are so many gays on the telly and stuff, surely incurring God's imminent wrath. Like Joseph Smith and the next few polygamous Mormon prophets, these end times fundamentalists have a very love-hate relationship with their American exceptionalism. They flip-flop constantly between declaring the USA to be God's chosen nation with a divinely inspired constitution to condemning its wickedness and proclaiming its imminent destruction. So it is important to get armed to the teeth and store supplies to get away from the cities like Salt Lake and go and live off grid somewhere remote. This is what Mormons were doing right from the start in their restless, voluntary and involuntary relocating from one place to another in a constant state of anxiety and existential fear of calamity. It is interesting that the website begins with an official statement about a Latter-day David dated 27th of October 2023 stating that it does not endorse anyone claiming to be the Davidic servant. This was the very same date the news went global that LDS Idaho temple worker Spring Thibodeau and her brother Brooke Hale had kidnapped her 16-year-old son Blaze from Arizona and taken him to Canada because she is convinced that her normal sports jock son, who doesn't believe any of it, is destined to be Avraham Gileadi's Davidic servant, and just needed taking somewhere remote and off-grid to convince him and presumably train him up while the imminent apocalypse unfolds. Kind of like a Mormon John Connor being trained up by his mum in secret to fight the coming Terminators when he grows up. Fingers were quickly pointed in Avraham Gileadi's direction as the source of this belief. The police later intercepted and arrested Spring and Brooke as they tried to take Blaze across the border from Canada to Alaska. The news media have just revealed that after being extradited from Alaska to Arizona, Spring is now being held on the same floor of the same jail as Lori Vallow, who, after being convicted of murdering her children in Idaho because they were possessed by evil spirits, is to stand trial for allegedly earlier murdering her ex-husband in Arizona. You really couldn't make this up. So why are Megan Farner and thousands of other people like her lapping up this dangerous nonsense from people like Avraham Gileadi? Because they are underinformed TBMs who have grown up being told all their lives to trust their emotions as the ultimate arbiter of truth, and are starving hungry for a leader as exciting, productive, and powerful as Joseph Smith to turn up after more than a century of boring and pointless LDS prophets who have demonstrably failed to set the world alight or produce any translations of the sealed plates of the Book of Mormon or the other promised scriptures. We just heard Megan and Avraham discussing all of that. And this is just one of the sideshows in the circus of murder and mayhem going on in Mormonland in the 21st century. This is why it is so dangerous and irresponsible of Avraham to throw into that heady mix of religious extremism and personal manifest destiny the idea that there is still a really significant Messiah-like prophet to come before Jesus can return, and that this person will emerge from obscurity rather than the ranks of the general authorities. So literally, it could be you or one of your children. Elizabeth Smart and Blaze Thibodeau would probably much rather he had kept his ideas to himself. Cross-reference that with the best-selling book claiming loads of near-death and visionary experiences by Tom Harrison called Visions of Glory, that describes in extreme detail a reality where we are constantly surrounded by and vulnerable to possession by demons when we sin or look at pornography. This book turns out to have been a huge influence on the beliefs and worldview of Latter-day Saints who have become superstars in a conflation of last days preppers, doomsday prophets, and abusive therapists, including Tom Harrison himself, and the therapists he has mentored and inspired to become very influential in Utah, and have had lots of bishops referring members to them for counseling. A lot of these trusting victims ended up having their marriages ruined or had their children imprisoned, starved, and tortured by his protégés, like Jody Hildebrand, who was recently arrested for this abuse. Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow used Tom Harrison's ideas to justify murdering their family members and children because they believed they had been taken over by these evil spirits. Lori was literally reading Visions of Glory by the pool in Hawaii when the police served them with a legal requirement to produce their children and prove they were safe. Julie Rowe who a few years ago was constantly in the headlines for claiming to have visions of an imminent apocalypse that had lots of prepper Latter-day Saints buying tents and ready to head for the hills, was also a fan. And so is the whole Rod Meldrum Heartlands crowd, who have invited all these characters to speak at their conferences. Even recent LDS Operation Underground allegedly trafficked children rescuer hero Tim Ballard, whose movie The Sound of Freedom was a surprise hit this summer, turns out to have been even more of a predatory con artist than he already seemed to the skeptical observer. He has made a fortune and rescued hardly anyone. He has used the whole project as a cover to enrich himself and involve the leading lights in the Utah establishment to give his companies credibility and assist fundraising, including Utah Senator Mike Lee.
From those who have been involved in child sex trafficking, are they subjected to inhumane treatment?
Absolutely. The worst scenarios you could dream up. That's what they've been involved in. Not only during the New York Times, in fact, Senator Harris pointed out, the New York Times just this week talked about 100 different cases of women, children who were being brought in by the cartels at first to smuggle them. But then remember, that cartel is in charge, and they can switch and say, now it's a trafficking. I'm going to traffic you. I can make more money if I just keep you.
Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes, who was meant to be investigating complaints of sexual assault against him, but instead went on an Operation Underground Railroad jolly in Colombia with Tim Ballard. Superstar political talk show host and campaigner Glenn Beck, and M. Russell Actual Ballard, acting president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles. The details are incredible and convoluted, so I won't be going into all of those here. The rest of the Bloggernacle and now the secular press is doing a fantastic job reporting and analysing it all. But for the purposes of this podcast, suffice it to say that this has once again blown the lid off the unrestrained conflation of church and state in areas where the Latter-day Saints are a majority or a significant percentage of the population. How overweening greed for ever more money has entangled these dreadful people with each other, and how the dumbest ideas and the belief systems the general authorities have entrenched and taught personally or permitted to become widespread in their membership without responsible opposition have taken hold of people's belief systems and ended up killing the children of God they are meant to be protecting. As I shared at the start, in the next episode, 11C, the shared eternal core of the general authorities and the pseudo-scientific loon bats, we will dive into the 2019 Eternal Core Conference that Tom Harrison organised, to which he invited all his mentees and people representing the different aspects of his worldview, and gave them all the opportunity to speak. Their presentations have just been deleted from YouTube as Tom Harrison realizes too late that he is in deep doo-doo. But I got there first and downloaded them for posterity before the purge. And I will prove beyond any doubt that these people are not fringe extremists who have nothing in common with the mind and will of the First Presidency and the ordinary members of the Church, but are very much singing from the same hymn sheet, stained as it is with the blood and the tears of their children.